crossing the Rhine. Some of my friends who maybe are still listening, some of my friends from Garden Valley Pipe Band will recognize the melody. We know it as Bonaparte crossing the Rockies.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Tell me about the tune itself. How'd you come across it? You're playing it on Uilleann pipes. I don't know. Just when I mention this tune, what comes to mind?
Yeah, well, it's a cool tune. It's funny. I expected you to say that it reminded that everybody knows it as Battle of Waterloo, because that's how most Highland pipers know it, as the Battle of Waterloo, rather than
Yeah, absolutely.
Bonaparte crossing the Rhine. But yeah, it's a cool tune. It was sort of a funny thing. The pipe band I was in college, First City Pipe Band, like it was all a bunch of people that had learned from the same guy, who was a piper at a pretty good pipe band, kind of here there in Minnesota, McAllister Pipe Band, which is attached to McAllister College. And so he had kind of taught a bunch of people that were kind of older pipers, like kind of started in their 40s. And so there wasn't like a great level of crispness or, quality of play. It was like, it was a parade band, But one guy was sort of, I don't know, like he was maybe the worst of us, feels weird, but he was definitely like the most eccentric of us. And also like it took him a really long time to get on the pipes, and we just kind of didn't take him as seriously as maybe we should have. But
and to be fair, like saying the most eccentric of a group of pipers and drummers, that's pretty darn eccentric, right?
Yeah, fair enough. But he just showed up with he started playing a tune that none of us had like taught him. Like I was the only person in that band that had learned someplace else and had learned as a kid, and but he just showed up to practice one night playing this tune. We're like, what the hell is that tune? It's so good. And it was the Battle of Waterloo. And it's such a cracking, good march. And I started playing it a bunch because, I spent a lot of time portraying a bagpiper in the 18th century and kind of early 19th century, who I think wound up playing at the Battle of Waterloo. It's not 100% sure. But
so I was aware of your reenactment stuff. I figured you were just like a piper to provide ambiance. I hadn't realized that at any point you had you were impersonating a specific historical figure.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. I worked as a park ranger for a bunch of years at a site, and I always took, my entry into reenacting was through I was a bagpiper first, and just my parents my dad had already been scoping out how expensive kilts were, and we went to a reenactment, just like a random carnival kind of thing, and somebody had a kilt for sale for $40, and he's like, "Oh, we're buying your kilt here right now." But like a $40 kilt at a reenactment made out of questionable acrylic, and like box pleated isn't really the same thing as most pipers wear these days. So kind of before I knew anything about reenacting, I already had like a historic outfit and was going around to things. And pretty quickly I became sort of like, oh, I shouldn't really be talking about Jacobite history in Wisconsin. But anyway, I wound up getting a job as a park ranger, and I just sort of discredited, or I didn't think about the bagpipe stuff at all. Like, oh, well, I'll play bagpipes here for ambiance, but there must not be much of a story here. And then no, sure enough, the fur trading company at this site I worked at hired a guy just to play bagpipes, a guy named George Mackay. And we kind of lose track of George Mackay. He got tracked. He got hired just to play bagpipes, supposedly, and then when they found out he could read, write, and do math, they made him run a fur post on the Red River, which is, the border between Minnesota, Manitoba, and North Dakota, so not ideal kilt
right,
area.
Not at all. Yeah.
So he sort of disappears from the fur trade, and then the next George Mackay bagpiper we hear about is a piper at Waterloo. And the pipes that were played at Waterloo actually survive today. You can go see them at the Piping Center. So the pipes that play are kind of copies of those. And it's, George Mackay isn't the least common name in all of Scottish history. So
you got a decent chance it might be the same guy, huh?
It might be the same guy. It could also, it's not quite John Smith level of
right.
A lot of names like that, but it's possible. But anyway, so I would often finish my bagpipe presentations with Battle of Waterloo and didn't really think much about the tune. And then just for my podcast of kind of looking into the history of tunes and playing a bunch of different settings, I did an episode on Napoleonic history and bagpipe tunes and stuff, and thought I'd look into Waterloo. And it's sort of cool. This setting, Bonaparte crossing the Rhine, I think is the oldest setting. It's the oldest setting I could find anyway.
And so where you did it on your Uilleann pipes, does that like I've been curious about this with just about every recording I've heard from your podcast, is like, to what degree are you maybe looking at the music and sort of taking some liberties, either to fit it to your instrument or just to fit your own style, and or to what degree are you like, no, I want to represent this as, black and white accurate to what's on the paper as possible?
So generally, if I'm playing a thing on Uilleann pipes, there's exceptions to this, but a lot of the things I'm playing on Uilleann pipes, I'm just using the Uilleann pipe to stand in for a fiddle. So there's a lot more music published for like German flute or for fiddle in the time period I'm interested in than there is for bagpipes. And so, this tune's kind of weird. It almost certainly is older than this, but the oldest setting I could find, or at least the one I'm playing, is from Francis O'Neill, who has this like massive collection of Irish music. O'Neill's sort of a weird dude. He was I think a police sergeant or some kind of a policeman in Chicago, but an Uilleann piper, and wound up collecting a bunch of tunes kind of amongst Irish immigrants in the United States, and then ultimately kind of going over to Ireland and trading tunes and collecting tunes and stuff too. But he's got these massive collections and has written some stuff on the history of Irish pipers and minstrels and things like that in Ireland. But so his setting, it's not published until 1903, but it almost certainly is older than that. But the tune Battle of Waterloo is a lot of times attributed to Wee Donald, so Donald MacLeod, kind of the famous bagpipe tune composer. He's written so many awesome Highland pipe tunes in sort of the mid 20th century. But supposedly Donald heard a fiddler playing Bonaparte Crossing the Rhine and made the adjustments to turn it into the Battle of Waterloo that we hear today. But yeah, so when I was trying to figure out like what to put on the album, it was just, what recordings weren't terrible, like didn't have errors and the sound popping and stuff like that, and also I didn't hate how I sounded playing it. And I just came to the conclusion, as much as I love Battle of Waterloo, Bonaparte Crossing the Rhine is I prefer that setting of it. It's a good tune.
I see. Now, I want to unpack like so many things that you mentioned in there. And so like maybe this is an appropriate spot to give you just a minute to tell me about your podcast, which is the way that I personally found you. Maybe even could you start with the name, because I haven't found, I know I haven't exhausted your entire catalog of episodes, and so maybe you mention it in there, but I have not yet come to an episode where you explain.
Yeah, no,
tell me about that.
I don't.
or you know what? If you don't want to, if you'd rather be a mystery, that's fine too.
No, I'll explain it. It's sort of funny. I'm a little upset with you because I just wound up going back and listening to old episodes of the podcast and just having that full on, I was a fool when I was 20. I thought I was better than this. But so, yeah, I started the podcast when I was 20, so in 2006. And I think I was the only bagpipe podcast around, although maybe I just wasn't searching right, but it sure seemed like I was the only bagpipe podcast around. After I put out a couple episodes, and then the National Piping Center put out a podcast, but it was a video podcast because that was sort of where everybody thought this was going. And that was very short-lived. I think they had 2 episodes. And I don't know. Podcasts were sort of brand new. I always joke that it was like just me and Skin Ninja.
Right, I have heard you mention that.
That was about it. But I had no idea for a title. I don't know what inspired me to think, what I should do is make a podcast. And so like I joked in the first episode to say, I guess it's going to be Wetootwaag's podcast of bagpipe power. That's a dumb name. I'll come up with something better. And then
wasn't it like season 4 or so that you first were like, I guess I'll take the power thing off of it, right? Because of the unfortunate association some people made with white power, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I was always nervous about. And like, so that was having Wetootwaag in there felt like a cure to that, I think, in my 20-year-old head. Like, so Wetootwaag's my nickname in Ojibwe language, which is, an indigenous language in Lake Superior, the Great Lakes area. And I was going to college to study that. So like I was taking classes in Ojibwe language and wound up with this nickname Wetootwaag that a lot of people called me by. And as like a white kid taking indigenous language classes, when a bunch of native people start calling you something, you're like, heck yeah, that's what I'm going to be known as.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also liked it because it's stupid. Like it's, I'll jokingly say, Wetootwaag, it means like powerful, brave warrior, but it really means Jello, like Jello pudding is what it translates to. And it just, so it's like, so my thought the reason that Wetootwaag's podcast, A Big Pipe Power, stuck around as a name for so long is that I was like, okay, well, clearly white supremacists will know, especially those early episodes. I would talk in Ojibwe a fair amount,
Right. Yeah.
and I was like, yeah, they'll know that this isn't for white supremacy because I'm speaking indigenous language.
Yeah.
But that's absurd.
Yeah.
Ojibwe is not, as much as it's a language that was spoke over a pretty huge chunk of the United States and Canada, and the Algonquian language in general, like even farther spread, or Algonquian languages, it's not a thing that people identify. And even like that first year back in 2006 or 7, I remember people like blogging about the show saying, "Oh, my favorite parts are when you talk in Gaelic." I'm like, "Oh, I do not do that at all."
You were counting on other people like doing research and things like that, or Google searches, for example.
Yeah. But even then, you wouldn't be able to do it because I spell it just ever so slightly differently than it shows up in dictionaries.
So there were some misconceptions going on there.
Yeah, and like honestly, so I was struggling with like the name, and I don't know, I've been frustrated with I don't, because of being a park ranger, I'm not a park ranger anymore, but when I was a park ranger, I had the luxury of being able to perform bagpipes sort of for a living, in a very controlled setting where I could be very clear about what the purpose of it was and how people were kind of supposed to interact with it. And I got spoiled with that. And the number of times, the few gigs that I would play out for museums and stuff, like there's one gig on Madeline Island and Lake Superior that I would do pretty regularly. And Madeline Island, it's a funny thing because it's a really important place for like Ojibwe history, but as like much of the history of Indigenous people in the Americas, Madeline Island was sort of cleared out of Native people, and it became like first it was a fishing camp for white folks, then a tourist destination, and now it's still a tourist destination, but there's a lot of weird like open liquor laws, so you can just walk around the whole island with open
bottle in hand.
Open canvas. Yeah, and it kind of attracts this weird mixture of kind of hippies and just ultra problematic people, I guess. And so I'd be playing there, and somebody would got by, and I always have this thing of like, oh, I think I know what those patches are, like on your stick, on your scooter or on your coat, right. And like just realizing that there's an association with white supremacy and white power that bagpipes like kind of certainly attract people like that. It tend to. And there is a history of like it's not like bagpipes themselves aren't to blame, obviously it's people using it, but like the KKK uses bagpipes and Amazing Grace as like part of, I mean, it's such a absurd connection. Like Amazing Grace has its own weird fraught history of abolition, like a weird abolition slave owning stuff, but it's just weird that the Klan uses it as like, this is our tune, like that's written by a dude that like was a slave trader and was like, oh, I shouldn't do this anymore. Like, right, okay, cool.
Yeah, it is an unfortunate thing, but I suspect that probably a lot of us, if we're looking for it anyway, we probably have noticed an unfortunate tying together that happens in some people's heads, where like you go to a Scottish festival and it's like, well, you can be there for the right reasons, but then that there are some people there who maybe have like what I personally would say are morally not right reasons for getting excited about some of this stuff,
Yeah, so I don't know. Anyway, so I was.
Hey, but is that island the one that has the church at which you did? I think it's your second to last tune on the album.
No, St. Clement's Church is in. It's on the Isle of Harris. So it's like the southernmost. It's really like the southern tip of the Isle of Harris, and it's where the MacLeods of Dunvegan and of Harris kind of buried their chiefs and stuff like that.
I really like what's the word for the audio style or the audio feel there? Is it ambience? There's like some really good ambience in that recording. Like you can hear that it's a big space,
Yeah, and it's really not. It's not a particularly big church, but but there's nothing in it, and it's stone. So it really, I guess it's pretty big. There's like little, there's some little arms or whatever, like kind of rooms that kind of stick off to the side of the main kind of cathedral section where there's more people buried and things. It's a really amazing space. We were there on a Sunday, which famously if you're going to the Outer Hebrides, you kind of have to be careful about traveling around on Sunday because everything's closed. But the church is like a historic site without interpreters there, so it was unlocked. We drove all over the island because we wanted to go see some brocks and standing stones, which didn't close obviously, and then. And yeah, I just kind of randomly drove down to St. Clement's Church thinking there's no way this will be open. And it was open and we were the only ones there. And kind of the whole day we had been dodging big tour buses filled with people walking around the stones of Collinish and Brock's and stuff like that. So it's a really nice treat to have St. Clement's Church all to ourselves for, I think, about 40 minutes. So I recorded a couple tunes there. But.
Oh, so it was impromptu, huh? That recording, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it was impromptu, and it's an improvised playing, too.
That's right.
Yeah, it was sort of, like, I don't know, like we didn't go to Skye this last trip, but I did the whole bagpipe tourist thing of, like, well, we gotta go find Borreg and go to Dunvegan on Skye and kind of think about the McCrimmon's, and so I had been thinking that, like, oh, man, I bet McCrimmon's played in this church, for people that were buried in, for services and ceremonies and things like that, which I'm actually not sure about. Like the timeline of, it's so funny that church is built, I think less than 100 years before the Reformation, or like before kind of Protestantism comes to Scotland in a huge way, and so it wasn't used for terribly long, and kind of it was in various stages of ruin, but it was still a great place to record. So just wanted to go in there and play some tunes and try to feel some connection, but really just anywhere just sounds cool over there. It's such a good instrument for that. But.
Well, I don't mean to sidetrack you too much. I feel like you've got a wealth of stories and information, so I just want to dive down every little alleyway. But let me allow you to reel it back and talk some more about the podcast, because I'm pretty sure you are the first bagpiping podcast chronologically.
Yeah,
sure.
I think so too. And it's sort of weird. Listening back to that first episode of, like, at no point in there do I explain why I'm doing this. Like,
maybe I wondered. I was like, maybe he explains it in Ojibwe. Maybe I just don't know because it wasn't in English.
No, I don't think so. It's just, I mean, at that point, I just posted on my Facebook feed for the podcast saying, like, woof, there's nothing that makes me want to quit doing this more than listening to myself from 2006. So I don't know what inspired me to do it. I was a 20-year-old dude that liked playing bagpipes, and I think I was enjoying playing around with that medium. I know it came and went in fits and starts. I wound up taking a class in blogs and wikis or something for my undergrad, where I got to, like, the key to college is to find ways to get credit for things you're already doing. That was the key to me. And so I was able to do the podcast for, like, class credit for a while, and it just kind of came and went. And then when I started dating my wife, who lived in North Carolina, I would spend a lot of winters down there, kind of away from my friends in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And the podcast became a way for me to, like, keep in touch with them, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, like, the next couple iterations of the podcast were that, but it was still just me. Like, at no point in the podcast run was it anything other than me talking about tunes and playing those tunes, and generally not even talking about them in a meaningful way. Like, just like, oh, I guess I'm going to play these tunes. I don't even remember what they're called.
Was that partly because there was also a whiskey tasting element? Did that drive some of the clear details from mind?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I just wasn't, I wasn't, in my head, there was this disconnect between history and bagpiping. For me, history was about, like, indigenous history, and that was something to be taken seriously, and piping was my hobby. And then when I got more serious into, like, historical piping, I wasn't really doing the podcast anymore. And so this new iteration, I'm pretty proud of the podcast now.
I think you should be, man. It's great.
Yeah, it feels like, I always say, like, this is the podcast I wish existed when I was starting to, like, play historic or think about historic bagpiping.
Yeah.
Just because it was so challenging once I started doing historic bagpipe programs to find tunes that we knew for sure were from the 1780s or 70s that weren't Pibroch. And so, yeah, I was just, like, kind of defeated at that, and wound up playing a lot of Donald MacDonald tunes, which were published in 1828. Or 1838 too, and, like, those are good tunes. And in hindsight now, after doing the podcast for a year with this more focused historical bent, I know that most of the tunes I was playing out of that collection did date back to the time period I was talking about, which was the 1790s. But
Yeah.
it's just been really interesting now that everything has gone, so many resources are digital. Like you can look at everything in John Glenn's collection, tune book wise, on the National Library of Scotland. So there's just this, it's just, archives are great. You can really like stand on the backs of people that have done all this work beforehand. And so yeah, so that's what's happened. So
Well, let me just
during,
tell you real quick, Jeremy. For me
yeah,
personally, and I suspect it's the same for a lot of your other listeners, you are what's the word, you're a medium that stands between.
oh sure,
Like there's this big. I'm aware that there are these cool historical like collections of tunes, right? Like
yeah,
Timothy Cummings references them in some of his collections of tunes, stuff like that. Like
yeah,
I know they're out there, and I have on occasion, hopped on Wikipedia to find like, the old lyrics to some old folk song, usually more like Americana stuff in my case. But your podcast for me is like, oh, this guy is my curator, right? Like
sure,
this
yeah,
guy will go through all the work. So you mentioned standing on the shoulders of all these people who compiled these collections, right?
yeah,
And I have thought to myself before, like, man, I'm sure glad that this guy took years of his life to travel around multiple countries and, write down what people were singing, to get an idea of what these old tunes were. But
yeah,
then there's a lot of work to combing through that, so one is grateful that it's there, but then to comb through it and find like, oh, this tune's nice, this tune fits, this tune works, and and here's
yeah.
what it sounds like, that's the job that for me, I'm kind of using you, you know what I mean? Like,
Well, that's great. I mean,
you
that's
do
the
that
hope,
for
right?
me, and then I get
Yeah.
to listen to you and go, of these 6 tunes he just did, this is the one I'm going to learn today,
Yeah,
And
that's great. I mean, that was sort of the hope, right? Like, and especially probably around the 10th episode or so of the kind of new iteration of the podcast, I started posting links to all so
Yes.
like
Yeah.
on every single show there's a link to an archival copy of the tune I'm playing, unless it's like in a published collection that isn't online, which is the case with all these William Dixon tunes. And I keep on, after spending so much time reading music off a computer screen, I've recently bought like 5 books of music, that I feel bad that I'm going to wind up being like, well, you have to buy this book in order
Right.
to do that.
Oh, don't feel bad. Good for the publishers.
Yeah, right. Well, that's it too. Yeah, it's been cool to like build these relationships with some of the people that have done that work. Like I don't know. I appreciate that you say like I'm a curator, but it is. I often like I started doing this work kind of haphazardly, and then found out about Traditional Tune Archive, which is this amazing website where you can type in any tune just about in kind of Irish or Scottish or English collections, and American for that matter, and it's there in ABC notation as well as all the various places it's been published, which is a great starting point. But before all this stuff was done online, like people like Matt Seattle, who does a lot of kind of focuses, he's the one that published the William Dixon collection, but also he's been doing that work of like finding concordances for years, and it's just, yeah, every time I play a tune that's in a Matt Dixon or a Matt Seattle book, I always feel like, oh, I'm cheating this week, because all this work's done.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been a blast to kind of look around and play at it, and yeah. So the podcast, anyway, so back to the podcast, what the point of it is,
sorry.
what it's called,
I
I
keep,
guess.
I keep pulling you off track. Carry on.
Yeah, well, I'm like nearly going to, I think about a connection and then I run with it, but
Yeah.
but yeah, even like I might have ditched the Wetootwaag name in the reiteration of the podcast, but also whatever, I like it, so
Yeah.
it's just gonna stick around.
Yeah,
but
at some
but
point,
mostly
it just is
I
what
was
it is, right?
yeah, I was asking a buddy of mine who had a D&D podcast about like what service he was using, because I was sick of using, like, when I started podcasting, the free software for podcasting gave you a bunch of information, like where people are listening from and that sort of thing. And slowly but surely, as podcasting became more common and more people were doing it, that stuff all got moved behind paywalls.
Yes, of course it
and
is, right? Like,
yeah,
like, no, it costs us nothing to provide this information, but it's going to cost you $10 a month. Like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And so and it was weird, like the last run of the podcast, like season 2 and 3, I was hitting the bandwidth limit every month, like where like my episodes would go down because I wasn't paying them enough to host it. And I was like,
Well,
okay,
some
if I'm
of
going to
these
do this
episodes do
again,
get kind of long when you have multiple tunes in there and stuff.
yeah, yeah, like most of them at this point
And
are like,
that's not me complaining, man. I love that.
yeah,
Give me more, But I can
yeah,
imagine that you'd be hitting
it's
limits.
rough. I've tried to like the podcast definitely started with like a ratio of me drunkenly rambling to tune. It was like 80% me drunkenly rambling per tune, and I have dialed that back significantly. But still, like at this point, like every episode is more than 10 tunes,
Yeah.
and like that takes some time to get through and to talk about. But yeah, I was talking to this buddy of mine that had a D&D podcast about what service he was using, and kind of he was really timed with his time. And then next thing, like before we had even finished talking about it, he had like Fireside, who I use, like if you pay at a certain level, you get a second podcast kind of built into it. So he just like bought it. He just like created the podcast, and it was Wetootwaag.com. I'm like, all right, we're doing this. I guess we're just keeping that name around. But for me, it was like, in 2020, like 2019, I realized that because I'm in graduate school now, trying to get a PhD, and that's some pretty exhausting and depressing work. And
Hey, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and jerk you off the path one more time here. What are you studying? I'm just curious. We've mentioned school a couple times. But...
yeah, Indigenous history. So
oh, you did mention that before. Okay.
Yeah, so it's so my dissertation's on kind of two-spirit Ojibwe history, kind of looking at 18th and 19th century gender and sexuality and that sort of stuff. There's this person, this person that I'm writing. Did I lose you? Weird. Okay.
I can still hear you. You still hear me?
Okay, my screen just all went black as if I hadn't done anything in too long a time. Anyway, this person, Ozawindib, is Ojibwe. She was kind of born like identified as male and like the son of this big tough Ojibwe chief, and then at some point she started living as a woman, and it's really interesting. Like there are like really different cultural concepts and things for Ojibwe gender and sexuality that don't translate particularly well. But
what century was that?
1760, I think, is around when she was born. Maybe 1740. It's a hard thing to figure out exactly.
I don't know as much as I should, but I've got this thing in my head. Is Ojibwe and Chippewa, are these the Anglified and Frenchified names for the same group of people?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I was thinking.
So supposedly the explanation that I've always really liked is that French people had a hard time with that A sound, like, and so rather than Ojibwe, it was Ojibwa. And then if you say Ojibwa faster and faster, Ojibwa, Chippewa, it winds up as Chippewa. But then when reservations were established...
Cajun.
Yeah, exactly. But when reservations were established, it was sort of weird. So the French come in, they're like, okay, Soto and Chippewa is what we call these people. The English came in, just copied the French. Then the Americans came in, and when reservations were established, that became like legal title. So all of the Ojibwe reservations in the United States were first called Chippewa, and many have kind of gone through the pain of legally changing name and title and stuff to Ojibwe. But it's a lot of work.
A lot of work for an individual, for a whole nation.
Yeah, for a whole community. Like you think about like all of the legal documents that, like how much of the stuff in our daily life has the state we live in on it or the nation. It's just so it's a lot of work. So not everybody has done that work. But
so you're in grad school now, you were saying, and that's
in grad school now, and realized that I wasn't playing bagpipes nearly as much as I used to, and that playing music made me happy, and I wanted to play bagpipes more. So I decided, like, okay, 2020, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to play a tune every day thing, and that'll cheer me up. It'll make me happier. I'll be more productive and all that jazz. And then COVID happened. It's like, and it was really important to be playing a tune every day. And it turned out that, then on St. Patrick's Day, I kind of missed that sense of community and thought, oh, what the heck, I'll just throw an episode up of the podcast and see if anybody's still listening, and like got a couple hundred downloads right away. Like, oh, okay,
you noticed that the world is starving for content.
Right. Yeah, I kind of, everybody that started anything early in the pandemic, those are some untrue numbers for long lasting, But it was, I don't know, like it was terrible, but in a lot of ways, like those early weeks of the pandemic were like some of the best moments. Like I've never thought better about like my neighbors or like the country as a whole. Like, man, it really feels like everybody's pulling together. It didn't take long for that to disintegrate, but it was great for a little bit of time there. but yeah, so I started doing the podcast, and at first it was just like, oh, I'm recording these tunes every day anyway, so I can just plug them in there. And then quickly was like, well, I guess I could do a more guided, like historic approach to music, and yeah, so that's what it is now. Is kind of picking. Sometimes I pick like 2 or 3 tunes and play, anywhere from 3 other to 5 other variations of it that you see in different collections. I'm always really excited to find music that kind of shows up in England or in the Borders, in Scotland and in Ireland. Like if I can finding tunes that are in all those places is always fun for me. But lately it's a lot less work to just like, oh, here's a printed collection I didn't know existed. Like Fitzmaurice's collection of Irish music, who is a Irish piper in Edinburgh, I think, and like moved there in the 1790s and published a book in like 1810 or so. But like playing through all these collections of tunes I didn't know existed yet, but are now online. So that's what the podcast is now anyway, is me playing through some collection of music that generally has ties to either the 18th or 19th century.
Yeah. Well, and let me just like, oh, by the way, while we've been talking, I've been scrolling back through Big Rab's full catalog of episodes to see. Episode 1 went up in January of 2017, and as far as I know, there was nothing before that other than you. So you are, I think you're the Podfather of Bagpiping podcast.
Yeah. It's so weird that like all the other bagpiping podcasts are interview podcasts, it's or just a host kind of talking.
Yep.
And that's what is interesting to me. Like it occurred to me like, oh, this would be easy. I think that it would be easier if I was interviewing or talking to somebody.
Oh, yes,
than,
definitely.
Playing all these tunes, but
that's why this show has this format, Jeremy. Honestly, like I thought to myself, I want to do this. Like a friend of mine, we had talked about doing something like this, and then he'd passed away, and so part of it was like a passion project. Like, hey, I'm going to make this happen. Great. You know what I mean? But definitely, I was like, what is sustainable? Well, every other week, no faster than that, and if it's an interview show, then I only have to prepare a few questions and I can let someone else do the talking. And so definitely the format you're doing is so much more labor intensive, not only because you're doing all the research and then divulging it to the listener, but it's also all this tune learning. I mean, that's one of the things that was blowing my mind right from the beginning. It's like, okay, maybe it's only 1 tune a day, but it's a tune a day.
Yeah.
Like what's that like for you? Do you feel like you've increased in your ability to sight read or learn quickly by doing this?
Holy cow, yes. Like if anybody ever doubts the whole, I don't need to practice, or practicing doesn't make me better, or I don't know that I'll ever be better. Playing a tune every day. And it wasn't like I was posting a tune every day. So sometimes, especially before we moved to a house, when I was living in a studio apartment and got closed for COVID. Like at first I was able to go to the music building on campus and record there. But that quickly went away during COVID. So I would go and find like a parking lot and record, 6 or 7 tunes or whatever to get me through the week. But still like having to play every day, like holding myself accountable to that. It really improved my playing, and I was sort of shocked to realize, I can sight read pretty well now. I actually had I don't know if I was anxious about our talk or what, or listening to the old podcast, but I had an anxiety dream last night about agreeing to a performance where I thought I was going to be playing one piece, and then it turns out I was going to be playing one piece on bagpipes and another piece on tuba. I've never played tuba. I have no idea how to play a tuba. But even in the dream, I was like, okay, I know what that note is. I'm going to guess that this is how I finger it.
And it came out okay?
No, it was horrible. Like, I could play 3 of the notes pretty good, but whenever there was like an 8th note, it was obvious to everyone watching that I didn't know what I was doing. But yeah, sight reading has become just a breeze to me now, which is not a thing. Like, I learned how to read music. One of the things that I think is really great about kind of the great Highland bagpipe tradition is that, it's great and bad at the same time, but I love that if you're going to learn Highland bagpipes, you learn how to read music. Like, that is part of it. That is a skill set that is important to this process, for playing in bands anyway.
Yeah.
And you lose something there. You definitely lose like a willingness to experiment and that kind of thing by having everything written, which is, I think, why everybody goes sort of loses their head when you're starting to learn Pibroch, because it doesn't look anything like it sounds. Whereas if you only learn things by ear, that's not a barrier. And it's been really interesting, like all of these, some of like the world's most famous Uilleann pipers, And even like people that play historic uilleann piping tunes can't read music. It's like
Yeah.
I was watching a lecture from Ronan Brown, who's this really good Irish piper, and he has a set of pipes, or I'm not sure if they're his or if he was just playing a set of pipes from the 18th century, but he was doing this presentation for Napibra Uilleann where he was playing through a bunch of 18th century tunes on these 18th century pipes. But he doesn't read any sheet music, so he had to have like a research assistant or somebody, like a friend, who would
Oh.
play the tunes that he thought sounded interesting. She would play them on fiddle, and then he'd be like, "Yeah, I'm gonna learn that."
Wow, really?
And it's like a real big. It's more important to learn by ear, and you can pick up tunes fast. So it's definitely something I want to try, is to learn by ear. But yeah, being able to sight read, it's like it's not a perfect transcription of how music was played in the 18th century to how people are recording it, but it's better than anything else we've got, kind of arguably. And really, my first instrument was Highland pipes, and I've complained about this a bunch, but I just have no music theory background at all. And kind of my favorite anecdote or example of this is when I asked my bagpipe teacher, Anne Brown, who's really good, really good piper, and really patient with me when I was 9 and asking a bunch of questions and wearing a kilt to practice all the time. But when I asked her what a treble, yeah. But when I asked her what a treble clef was, she's just like, just ignore that. You never
You don't
have
need
to
to
pay
know
attention to that. You're a bagpiper.
Did you ever encounter that thing where like in bagpipe notation music, right? You usually just say like C, right? But then you find out it's actually C sharp, kinda, and it's like, what are those little hashtags at the beginning of that staff?
Yeah, well, just ignore that. Just ignore that.
Yeah, you don't need that.
But yeah, so I was always, I understood everything. Every piece of music I looked at was interpreted through bagpipes. Even when I was like a percussionist in band trying to play the xylophone or something in high school, I would still think about things in terms of bagpipes. I borrowed a guitar from somebody and like used sticky notes to put where the bagpipe scale was on the frets, so I could pick tunes that way. But then uilleann pipes, it's all different. Like it's one, it starts way lower. Like my default had to like, oh no, I've actually got to think about this musically rather than just that note represents this finger positioning. And so that was sort of the biggest surprise when I realized that I could sight read music that would fit on uilleann pipes. That was a really big moment for me, and that's sort of where it's at today, I guess. But
yeah,
and it's cool now. I've got this set of a listener kind of lent me a set of border pipes that are, pitched in A, and so I can play it with uilleann pipes. And that's not a thing that I would have thought would have been possible to just kind of play through the score in kind of standard Highland pipe fingering and all that jazz, and then pick up uilleann pipes and play the same music, but as written, not making those adjustments, not playing it like they're Highland pipes. That's have a whole new level of respect for Jarlath Henderson, who was always playing with Ross Ansley on on border pipes. Like, oh, that's hard. I know that Jarlath is a good piper, but that is very hard. Oh, sorry.
That's when you start thinking like, does it not start to seem like, well, I mean, you've learned more than one language, so I think you can probably relate to that, like being not a dissimilar process of like you have to like break your brain and kind of rebuild it in a way,
Yeah.
But after you've broken your brain enough times, then it becomes an easier and easier process. So then, I'd assume that after you had broken your brain to go from Highland pipes to, I don't know, whistle and or uilleann pipes and guitar and all these other things, then breaking your brain to go to border pipes, like it becomes a more sort of pliable kind of process.
Oh yeah, I mean border pipes are so. I mean, I was already playing border pipe tunes on Highland pipes.
Yeah.
And then because it's the same fingering, it's just you get those naturals and sharps a little bit easier on a good set of border pipes. But I mean, it's sort of a bummer. Traditionally, really good border pipes, could play up into the second octave a fair bit, like at least like another half step up or whatever. Like up to D, I think is pretty normal, like high D. And most people playing border pipes now are just Highland pipers looking for a slightly quieter instrument. And so the instruments aren't really designed for that, because you've got it's a different chanter that you can overblow to get up there. And if you're a Highland piper just wanting to play a bunch of embellishments and stuff, if you squeeze too hard, it's going to jump the octave and you're going to be upset. And so, I love the instrument, but it's frustrating how like, oh yeah, I'm kind of blocked off from how this was supposed to, like how this is what this instrument is supposed to be capable of. But even in the 18th and 19th century, I get the sense that it's sort of the rare piper that would do those pinch notes and kind of go up to the second octave. But there's still part of me that's like, dang it, I really wish I wish I could do that.
Yeah.
Well,
there's still time.
Yeah.
You're still around.
Yeah. There's
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say there's the Banton water pipes I have, you can pinch up to high B pretty easily, and Will Woodson made the reed for it. And I was like, hey, so I'm pinching up to high B, but I know sometimes there's different fingerings. So is there a way to get to like high C and high D? He was like, that chanter is not designed even to go to high B, so no.
Like, so you're lucky you're getting what you got.
Yeah, sort of. But then, it was weird looking at, older sources, 18th and 19th century, and realizing that Highland pipers were doing that same thing of pinching up.
Yes, I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, I was just like, oh, you can pinch up the notes on a Highland pipe chanter? I wonder. And I assumed it would be this nearly impossible thing. And I was a buddy on Facebook, Bob Cameron, was talking about it. I was like, how do you do this? And he's like, yeah, just bury your thumb in the thumb hole, like kind of at an angle, and squeeze a little bit harder, and then open up the B note. I was like, oh, wow, sure enough, that is way easier than I expected, and I want to see what else I can do with this. And pretty quickly, playing this Hardy chanter from the 60s, I was able to get high B and high C, like, fairly reliably. The problem is, like, it is definitely a show-off thing because it's so easy for it to drop out, and then you're just kind of sitting there with a funky-sounding low B. But when it works, it's really cool. And I've played around with trying to do it like at speed with a jig or something, and it's like, no, that's beyond me. But for slow airs and stuff, you can really hold that high B and high C.
I mean, something like Old Lang Syne, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm gonna
Old Lang Syne.
I'll pull the audio for that one. People play it all over the place, especially around New Year's.
Right.
But you have to do that funky Highland bagpipe thing where you kind of hop some octaves.
Yeah, we'll just drop down here. Nobody will notice.
Nobody will notice. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then, or I'll just hang out on high A for a while until it comes back to where I can play it again.
Yeah, there's that grip on high A does a lot of work. I feel like.
Yeah, it does.
Like, I'll just add a lot of grips here, and people will understand what I'm doing.
I'll tell you what. Like, honestly, I have relied on that for like so many requests that come in for like funeral gigs. Where it's like, will you play this hymn or will you play this old cowboy song or whatever it is? It's like, well, let's see. I can do it up to here, and then I guess I'll hang out on a high A for 7, 8, 9 counts, and then I can come back in.
Yeah.
So that I have tried that. You described that to me, that dig your thumb into it thing, and I tried it a little bit on one of my Highland chanters, and I'm not having success with it. Did it take you a while to get it to work, or like did you find any little tricks or anything? Because I'm jealous, man. I want that high B.
Yeah. So one of the things that helps is to do an alternate fingering for high A. So your high A is just the back thumb open rather than like the whole thing. So if you do a high A fingering that way, that might help a little bit. And then it's a lot of pressure. Like, and some chanters just can't do it. So it's worth experimenting around with different chanters. I assumed that my Hardy chanter could do it because it was old and had sort of a softer reed in it. But then I put a McCallum chanter in with a hard enough reed, and it could go up. It was maybe easier. And the McCallum chanter was maybe from like 2005 or something. So it was relatively recent. But yeah, I think just go for it. Keep trying. And it also takes, you have to give it more pressure. So the way that most Highland pipers have their drones set up, if they're set up properly, your drones will probably churn off when you squeeze up to it. So you have to make some adjustments there so they'll keep going. Yeah, so I think that's why people don't do it. when I first started experimenting around with it, was posting on Reddit or something, and somebody's like, yeah, I've also wondered like why we aren't seeing, like, it's sort of weird that Gordon Duncan never did it, or at least didn't like perform it around a bunch. I'm surprised that, like, is it Lincoln Hilton from Australia? Like, that sort of seems like the sort of thing. Like, I really, you'd kind of think that these like the epitome of hotshot pipers might try this stuff out.
Yeah, kind of use this trick here and there.
Yeah, because I think the first time some big name does it, people are going to lose their mind.
Oh,
like,
for sure.
That's not a thing. I mean, that's what I felt like when I first got it. Like, I had this sort of embarrassing Facebook Live video where I was, because in the back of my head, I had thought about it. I had actually thought I wanted to get that border pipe sound before I knew border pipes are expensive. It was going to take a while for me to get one. Yeah. So I thought about making adjustments to a chanter reed in order to get up there. And I just didn't even occur to me, like, oh no, you can just do it. Like, you just gotta
just with your standard kit, just go for it.
Yeah, like, oh, all right. So yeah, I have this Facebook Live video of me just like my face completely like, I don't believe it. Check this out.
We caught the live reaction, huh?
yeah.
I have had, like, I've wanted so badly to be able to like get a more accurate accidental out of like cross fingering on my Highland chanter and stuff like that. And every once in a while, I get the right read at the right, point in its life that it does work. But man, it's so rare when it does work. You know what I mean? And
like, it's such a I know exactly what you mean. Like, have you ever, the Hardy chanter, not the Hardy one, whatever chanter I was playing before the Hardy one would do this thing where I think it was a nail wooden chanter or a McCallum one, but the reed I had in there, it would sometimes do it, but like I could do the incidental on the way up, but not on the way down or something.
Interesting.
Like, it was just, and sometimes I'd be fingering the incidental and holding the note, and then it would come in like after a couple beats. It's like, all right, cool, I guess we're there. But yeah, that's really one of the nice things about uilleann pipes and border pipes is like, no, those notes are just always there. You don't have to, there's no wizardry to get the reed quite right and the atmosphere quite right for it to work. But in a way, like, these things that are hard and like not technically what it's designed to do, it sort of makes them all the better when it works. Like, oh,
for sure.
something has happened. It's not really good for like performing, but it's, for your home practice, which, that's mostly what I do at this point is play for myself.
Well, I think that there's something deep to that like there is something about like the inherent limitedness of the instrument. Yeah. That like, therefore you got to work for variety, and that's part of what makes variety or originality so satisfying. And in a similar way, it's like, my wife often laughs about how long we spend tuning our instruments, especially like at a band competition. Like, the whole day is tuning. Everybody's tuning, you don't really, the competition is tuning, like that's what it comes down to in so many ways, like how'd you do in your tuning circle, not so much when you actually played. And it's like, I understand that, absolutely. And that's part of what makes it so satisfying to hear a set of pipes or even a band that is just bang on in tune. Yeah. It's like such an elusive goal that when you do capture it, it's like magic.
Yeah. I definitely, I don't know. I'm struggling with, I don't know. I keep on debating whether I should need to get another set of Highland pipes, and I kind of am thinking about getting a B flat chanter too, because the reed that I got with the Hardy chanter was perfect, but it was a vintage reed too. Like, it wasn't from the 60s, but it was a reed maker that isn't making reeds anymore, but it really worked well with this chanter. And like, now I've got a Shepherd B flat reed in it, and it works, but it also is wildly easy to underblow. And I just won't even realize, like, well, I mean, everybody has been in that mode where you're playing and you think everything's fine, and then you hit a high A and realize, oh, I'm nowhere near up to pressure.
Yeah, it's not fine.
And that's where I'm at right now with it. It's like, oh, this is frustrating. Yeah. But it's just hard when like, it's such a limiting instrument. Like, it's so many moving parts to worry about. I mean, that relationship of reed to chanter is so hard. It was for uilleann pipes. Like, when I made the jump to uilleann pipes, to me it was like, oh, this is so liberating. 2 whole octaves, and you can tongue the notes and all these cool features. And it was interesting talking to people that like uilleann pipes is their second instrument, but they played something else before that was chromatic. Like, I was like, yeah, you can do anything with uilleann pipes, and they're like, no, you can't. What are you talking about? This is ridiculously restrictive, this instrument. Like, oh man, not compared to Highland pipes.
We're coming from different worlds, man.
Yeah.
So now, and speaking of hopping to uilleann pipes, I wanted to take a quick listen to Oyster Wives Rant, which is the title track for your album. Now, this album is a collection of those tune-a-day tunes, right? Like, sort of, you pulled from those, right?
Yeah, it's pulled from, all of them are tunes that I played on the podcast. And so it's sort of revealing, too, about what the, what the challenge is with the podcast, because it's absurdly long, right? There's 37 tracks. My first, like, pass-through of, because like I said, very quickly the podcast turned into about 10 different tunes a week.
Yeah.
And so picking through, over like 30 or 40 episodes, trying to find the ones I liked, I was like, okay, we got to get it down from 70, obviously.
Yeah, I remember those episodes when you're talking about like, okay, I thought I had a curated list, but it's 70 tunes, so maybe I'll trim it down even further.
Yeah. Yeah, but like it's not a long album. It's actually like a pretty normal length album because most of these tunes are not sets; they're just standalone tunes. So like Oyster Wives Rant is 30 seconds long.
Yeah.
So it's just me playing through it. And if it's the first track on it, that was what I used for the intro for the podcast for like the second half of that season. And yeah.
And we get to hear in here you playing whistles and uilleann pipes. So if you started on Highland pipes, I'm curious, where'd you go from there? Because a lot of pipers do pick up a bass whistle. I've got one here. Like a lot of pipers pick this up. And so did you go Highland pipes, uilleann pipes, whistle, or was the whistle in the middle? And also, do you think in D when you're playing the whistle, or G, or are you thinking in Highland pipe terms? I'm just curious for my own sake because
at this point I'm thinking in D. I should be thinking in G or A or whatever, but my brain can't handle. I still can't handle.
You made
keys.
one hop. Let's not make another hop. Right?
Yeah. I keep thinking like I should just take a music theory class to try to understand this stuff a little bit more. But when I was in that boat, it was always like I'm not a morning person, and like those music theory college classes are always like super early in the morning. Yeah. I guess I'm just gonna keep on struggling here. But yeah, when I'm playing whistle, I definitely think of it as an uilleann pipe. So kind of think of a thing in the key of D, or not in the key of D, but pitched in D.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started with Highland pipes, and I was a kid, and I think I started when I was like 9 or 8.
And where give me a little bit of your bio too here. This was was this in Wisconsin or Minnesota or what? Yeah,
it was in Wisconsin. Right? I was born kind of in the suburbs of Milwaukee, and family moved to Kansas for a little bit. And when we moved back to Milwaukee area, like my mom, in order to get us, my brother kind of fell in with a bad crowd in Wichita where we lived, and my mom was way more diplomatic than I think a lot of parents would be, and so she was like bribing us to be willing to leave. And so like she's like, anything you want if we can move back to Wisconsin. And my brother rented ferrets, so we got ferrets, which was cool. And then to be fair, like I didn't care. I was 7 when we left. But to be fair, it's like, anything you want, Jeremy? Like, what do you want if we go back to Wisconsin? And sort of out of the blue, I said, I want to play bagpipes. And she said, okay,
statement.
That's I guess we'll do that. And I always say it's sort of like when you're a 7-year-old or a 6-year-old, you're like, I want to be a fireman, and you don't really think about it yet. So I don't even know. Like my dad had this cassette tape of bagpipes that I think I enjoyed, and like I remember seeing a pipe band play in a parade before that point, but it was the drum that got me excited, not the bagpipes. So it's sort of
which one?
Sort of
weird. Was it tenor drum or?
It was the bass. It was hearing that bass come, over the hill. That's what got me excited. But yeah, we moved back to Wisconsin, and then my mom and dad both were like looking for a place and got me set up with lessons at the Billy Mitchell Scottish Pipes and Drums. And it was sort of, I kind of remember it where my dad said, "Well, we found you a place to teach you bagpipes," and I said, "Bag what?" Like it didn't. I didn't even remember. Yeah. But
kudos to your parents for not only being willing to let a child learn the bagpipes in their home, which is one of the most excruciating experiences for a person's ears, but also to buy their other child one of the stinkiest pets that you can possibly own. Yeah. They really love you guys.
Yeah, they went through it pretty bad. I mean, so my memory, remember asking for this, when I was a kid in Kansas, telling my mom. My dad's telling, so my parents were divorced, which is sort of why we wound up in Kansas. And then I lived with my mom, and my dad, when he used to tell people about how I started learning bagpipes, he would say, well, he lives with his mother, so I wanted to make sure to find a place where he could learn how to play bagpipes. So I don't know that there's too much truth in that, but yeah, I started playing Highland pipes, and I kind of immediately didn't like the band.
That's what I was wondering. So were you learning from a band basically? So it was straight into a band?
Yeah, and I don't know what it's like out there, but the scene that I was like growing up in, it really felt like if you want to learn bagpipes, you learn from a band because they give you free lessons because they're always looking for pipers.
Yeah.
And so that was it. Anne Brown was my teacher, and she was just very patient with me. At one point, I knew I wanted to be around the pipe band, but I thought I was so impatient to have pipes, and I was just so sick of being on practice chanter. And like in hindsight, like it must have been like a month and a half when I was like, this is taking too long.
How old did you say? Were you 7, 9?
I was 9 or 10, I think, when I started. I think 9 when I started lessons. And I like at one point I decided to quit bagpipes and become a percussionist. So I was like taking snare drum lessons, and I was like, well, this is harder than I thought. And I went back to bagpipes and like all this stuff. They told us when we started, like, yeah, it'll be at least a year before you get bagpipes. And I still wound up with bagpipes in a year, but it seemed like an eternity to a 9-year-old. So I was with the band, and then I did one gig. I played Irish Fest with the band once, and that was it. I was like, I don't really like this.
That was your band career, huh?
That was my band career, and I did one. I was frustrated because I didn't like being restricted to playing everything exactly as written, which is how a band is supposed to work, right? With all the grace notes and embellishments being the same. I didn't like that limiting factor, and I was already playing. I was playing stuff I shouldn't have been playing yet. Like I was, I remember at that point it was like the early '90s, and there's a couple guys playing like Steam Train to Malag was really big. Like it had just come out.
So you were one of these kids who didn't know the common marches, but was secretly learning the Pumpkin's Fancy or something like that.
Right, Pumpkin's Fancy, Clumsy Lover. It was all about the Clumsy Lover for me as a kid.
Clumsy Lover for sure, man. Get that high A section. Feels great.
Yeah. And then awkwardly too Pibroch, but I had no idea I was playing Pibroch. But
interesting.
That's my absolute favorite tune, a favorite song. Like I remember in middle school, you're supposed to bring in, okay, everybody bring in their favorite song to share with the class. And I brought in Androch Beag from Brother, this kind of Celtic rock band from Australia.
I love Brother. That makes me very. That's great. Cool.
But yeah, they're setting up a little spree. I just loved it so much, and that was it. And so I learned it by ear, and I would just play it. And I remember one of those guys that would play Steam Train to Malag walked in on me practicing the little spree, and he's like, are you playing Pibroch? I'm like, no, Pibroch's dumb. I hate it. This is a band called Brother. I just had no idea. But yeah, every time the band would move on to playing, their competition stuff like MSRs or more of the hornpipe jig stuff, the pipe major would dismiss me. Like, all right, get out of here, Jeremy. We're moving beyond you. And that just, it chafed me so bad. It's like, I know this stuff. I want to play this stuff. And so anyway, I kind of left the band and went looking for a set of uilleann pipes, because in my head, uilleann pipes were more freeing. You could do whatever you wanted with them. And
I've heard people describe it as like going from marching band to jazz.
Yeah, which is maybe not accurate. I don't know. It depends on what you do or who you're playing with and that sort of thing. I definitely did this wrong. So like by the time I was 13, I think I had a practice set of uilleann pipes that, were old, and I never had a lesson, didn't really know what I was doing.
You moved fast though, man. I feel like a lot of us Highland pipers, it's like, you're 12 or 13 years into your Highland piping before you start thinking, those uilleann pipes look kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it was sort of funny. I don't even know where I first heard Irish pipes, but I was like, oh, I like that. I want to do that.
Yeah.
And I got them from a Highland piper that had kind of done the same thing earlier, but had given up, as so many people do. Like, thankfully, he just bought a practice set before realizing this isn't a thing for him.
He didn't go spend, $20,000 on whatever it is for a full set.
These Highland pipers that just buy a full set of uilleann pipes right away, like, oh, dude, that's going to hurt. It's going to hurt when you realize this isn't a thing.
And everything.
Yeah. But I had that set. I could play the Kesh jig on it, and that was about it.
I
And
love that jig though. Great one to start with,
yeah,
man. That's awesome.
but it's the only tune there's only one second octave. There's like one or two second octave notes that are pretty easy to hit, and I just didn't quite understand what I was doing. And then like that instrument just sort of fell into disrepair, as you can imagine when like a teenager owns an uilleann pipe and doesn't know what they're doing. But I got it. It was super cheap for like it was. I could afford it with allowance money and kind of random stuff. Like I think I paid the guy like $200 or something, which is just absurd. I mean, granted that was the 90s.
Yeah, man. I'm jealous.
Yeah. But yeah, I wound up kind of being friends with an uilleann pipe maker in Minneapolis, St. Paul area in Minnesota.
I mean,
and
now wait. Honestly, like, it was the practice set, right? So it's like it's a goose, right? Like a bag with chanter and then some bellows, right?
Yep.
I mean,
That's
$200
it.
would buy you a set of bellows, right? So
Yeah, no, it was
came out okay.
yeah, it was wild. And I don't know, like I encountered a lot of like being a kid really interested in like at that point I was doing the living history stuff and this guy was a reenactor. He had also been in that band and didn't get along with the pipe major, so he had kind of quit in frustration. So we had a lot of like kindred spirits, but also like he was probably in his late 30s or 40s and I was like, 10 or 12 or whatever, and really interested in all of these things that I have just definitely encountered a lot of adults who are like, wow, you are very young to be interested in this stuff. I'm going to make sure that is nurtured rather than limited. So I'm really thankful for people like that. But so that might have been what's going on. But he also got it super cheap. It was sort of weird. It's a Quisthout practice set, and Quisthout is a Dutch maker who I think moved to England and is making again, but kind of took a hiatus for a while. But like whoever bought it initially bought it at like a Sam Goody, like at some random like instruments shop, like not from a specialist, not from Quisthout, but it was like part of the inventory at like a guitar and saxophone store. But they bought it. Whoever first bought it also paid next to nothing for it because it was like the 80s. But anyway, wound up with that, and I knew I needed a better instrument from that if I was going to play it anymore. And my grandma did this thing like grandparents often do, where I was listening. She wound up stealing this album from me of Eric Riegler playing uilleann pipes. And she just really liked it. I was like, Grandma, if you buy me a new set of bagpipes, I can play that stuff for you.
I'll do it for
and
you
she
live,
did the
Grandma.
thing.
All I need is
yeah. And she did the thing that grandparents do, like, oh, when I die, you can do that. Like, that is a ghoulish thing to say, Grandma. But she passed away, and I wound up inheriting enough money to buy a full set of uilleann pipes again before I really should have.
Yeah.
And kind of lucked out where, again, it was a friend who was sort of starting in his making career. So he's a good pipe maker, but he didn't have they weren't as expensive as they probably could have been or should have been.
Sure.
But again, wound up with a full set before I had any business having one. And I remember distinctly going to collect the pipes from him, and I guess I just didn't have a car then. But I asked him if he could like show me how to play something. He's like, oh, I don't do that. So I like asked for a lesson, and he's like, no, I don't do that. Just figure it out. It's like, okay.
I'll make them. I don't drive them.
Right. And so I kept on having uilleann pipes and not like getting a lesson, which I don't recommend. It took a really long time to get to where I am today.
There are more efficient ways.
Yeah. But when I got those, I started playing around more, and my idea that uilleann pipes were more liberating than Highland pipes were immediately dashed. Right?
Yeah.
Like I went to my first Irish session, and was playing with a bunch of like fiddlers and whistle players and stuff. But like all of a sudden, they were asking me to play uilleann pipe tunes. We're like, okay, play it like Seamus Ennis, or like, no, you should play it like the soloist. I'm like, oh, so now not only do I not get to play it how I want, but I have to play it exactly like somebody else did, but there's no music. Great.
And also, they're like, play it like Seamus Ennis. Oh, this legend. Okay. It's like showing up with a guitar and then being like, okay, yeah, but do it like Stevie Ray Vaughan, okay?
yeah, just it'll be fine. It'll be just totally fine.
Yeah, all right.
But again, like I got this set of Irish pipes thinking that it was not going to be a historical interest of mine, and thinking that Irish pipes were some new thing, and then realized like, oh no, this instrument was actually having like a real big kind of finalization in this time period that I was portraying as a park ranger. So I should look at these historic collections of tunes, and quickly realized that O'Farrell, whose pocket companions are sort of this really robust, cool collection of tunes, like he published a set of tunes when he was piping in London for this opera that I am 100% sure that these fur traders would go to when they were in London. So all of a sudden I was like, oh man, I've got like the bagpipers notes that played for the people that I'm portraying, a different piper that played for them. Like, I've got to learn this music. And that's the only way that I became the Island piper I am today, was just kind of fixating on O'Farrell's collection and playing through stuff. And I needed to get better in order to play those tunes. So
yeah,
but yeah, it definitely took way longer to be where I am. And there's still things like, I think last 2 weeks ago, I figured out how to backstitch, like, which is not, I mean, it's not like rudimentary stuff, but it's sort of rudimentary embellishments for uilleann piping. And I've been playing for like nearly 20 years or something, and like didn't know how to do it because I'm just fumbling around in the woods, is what it feels like.
Kind of finding your way, yeah. And so is the set you're playing right now, I'm trying to think back to the recordings if I would know. I think I remember hearing you play some regulators. So is it it's a full set? Just got everything in it?
Yeah, it's a full set. The regulators have always been, like, because I got a set of uilleann pipes with regulators and then didn't know how to play them and didn't play them for years. Mm-hmm. So they kind of fell into disrepair with the reeds and stuff. And then I also realized that the uilleann piper I was listening to the most, kind of in those days, was Jerry O'Sullivan, because Jerry O'Sullivan has this album of O'Farrell tunes. And Jerry O'Sullivan plays regulators quite a bit differently than most people because one of his regulators didn't work.
Oh, interesting.
So most uilleann pipers favor the regulators that are kind of closest to your body, the tenor and baritone.
Yeah.
And then the bass one is like an add-on that honestly not a lot of pipers don't even bother with, but it adds this kind of bass thing. But Jerry O'Sullivan's the regulator closest to him never worked, so he always favored that bass regulator. So that's how I started playing regulators, was just always hitting those bass notes. But yeah, so they're always a little bit imbalanced with the chanter, like they're just really honking loud. And a couple months ago, I was able to get a new chanter, which is it's a Calder Quinn chanter. It's just amazing. It's like the best. It's just about the best uilleann pipe chanter you can get. I mean, it is. It's the best uilleann pipe chanter you can get. Maybe there'll be some people that will argue about that, but it's definitely one of like the best makers. And I kind of lucked into asking somebody at the right time and having it. And at this point, this chanter is way softer.
Yeah.
And the regulators are just all over the place. So as much as I was starting to get halfway decent at regulators with my Boisvert chanter, now like I just haven't played them in months again. So I'm like kind of in that frustrating plateau moment of like, I guess I need to start saving and getting on somebody's waiting list to get a set of regulators that are more balanced with this chanter, or to like really sink all the time into learning how to read the thing myself so that I can have softer reeds in it. But
yeah, have you ever delved into making your own reeds for any of your pipes?
No, not really. Like I read, like I live in Iowa now, and Tim Britton lives not too far from me, who's kind of a big uilleann piper and old pipe maker, and has a book called like My Method about reed making. And after reading his book, I just like kind of played around with the fundamentals. I'm like, okay, I think I understand how this can work. And I like took a chunk of cedar and some stuff. Again, when I was a park ranger in the summers, I was working in a canoe warehouse where we build like birch bark canoes and other things. So we had a bunch of cedar around. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to take some of these shavings and see if I can't make something that'll make a sound.
Yeah.
And followed all the mechanics and finished it. I was like, well, this is stupid. It didn't work. This is a lot of work. But like one of the most frustrating parts about reed making is like when a thing, it's sort of like if you make wine or beer, they say don't throw it out because it might just need a little bit more time. It's sort of like that with reeds. Like you kind of make it and then you have to let it sit for a day and then come back to it. And that was my experience. I came back to this weird reed I had made out of cedar, and it didn't make a sound the day. And then 2 days later, I was back in the warehouse, picked it up, and it squawked. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm never going to do this. This is too much. Like,
cool,
like,
that was fun. Never.
Yeah, it was a good experience. But I kind of had this moment of, like, in the early days of the pandemic, I had that, like, apocalypse fear. Like,
yes.
oh, no.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
What am I going to do? I need to learn how to make reeds so I can source this.
Yep, oh, man. I'm sure you and I are not the only ones who, like, our first thought should have been food, but one of the first thoughts was, my reeds!
Yeah. And it's weird, too, like, 18th century, playing around and looking at... there's correspondence that exists between some of the Highland regiments kind of writing back to Scotland, being like, "We need reeds."
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah. I don't have the details of it. I should track it down. But a buddy of mine who was a piper back in the '60s and '70s, and still is. He's still a good piper when he plays. But he does doing a bunch of research on the American Revolution or something. I think it was either American Revolution or the French Indian War, but there was some Highland regiment that was writing back complaining about needing reeds to be shipped over.
That's so funny, man, 'cause I have wondered about that before, more in the context of just thinking about World War I and just thinking, like, how do you, like, field maintain your pipes, you know? Like, what do you do to keep them just making sound, you know? Like, how do you pack extra reeds in a way that they're not going to get soaked when you cross a river or dried out when it's too hot out and stuff like that? I hadn't really taken the next step to think, what if there's like a reed trade, you know, like when the supply drop comes, there's a little box that says for the pipers, you know?
Right. I mean, it's like in military are constantly complaining about being under resourced anyway. Like, you didn't send us gunpowder, lead, new uniforms, or reeds. Yeah.
Our piper's been squawking for 3 weeks now.
Yeah. But I don't know. Do you play cane reeds at all or no?
I have one bass cane reed from Adrian Melvin that I play with, like, as in I mess around with it, but I'm not nearly consistent enough to, like, get it into the sweet spot and keep it there. So
yeah, well, there's no keeping it there. Yeah, I was surprised. I wanted, because I was spending so much time talking about historic bagpiping at the park I worked at, and people would want to know how it worked, and I always felt self-conscious of, like, pulling out, and here's this big fiberglass thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You gotta get one of those easy drone reeds, right? So it, like, kind of looks like it could be wood.
Yeah, but then I started playing around with. It was honestly after, like, meeting with Tim Britton and him kind of showing me how the reed worked on my Uilleann pipe drones. I was like, oh, this is so much easier to understand than, like, all of the bells and whistles and screws and knobs and rubber bands I've got to worry about on a synthetic, on a synthetic drone. And so I switched over to cane for like a year, and they were so steady. Again, it's mostly just playing them a bunch, right? Yeah. Like, if you can play consistently, they'll work. But I guess you're up in some pretty high elevation. I'm not sure how much added hassle that becomes.
I'll tell you what, we are really excited about this elevation chanter that McCallum's talking about, or not McCallum, sorry, cool. McClellan Bagpipes is coming out with. It's going to be good for us, for sure. But yeah, I've got my buddy Swan plays on cane reeds, and yeah, he talks about it all the time about how, like, if you don't play every day, you know, you got to play them every day to keep them in that sweet spot. Yeah. In fact, I remember, I'm sure you're familiar with, I don't know how to say her name. She's a small piper that's very popular right now. She did
Breacher Campbell, yeah.
Thank you for pronouncing the name so I didn't have to try.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I became aware of her, like, just from some YouTube clips the same year that she came out with that album, The Reeling, which, love that album. And I remember watching a concert she'd done in Australia, where, like, part of what drew me to her sound was definitely her drones, like, such a unique sound. Like, I'm not sure how exactly to describe it, but very pleasant and seemed very unique. Really liked it a lot. And at some point during the show, she pops her drones out and she's like, this reed's giving me some trouble, and it's all cane reeds. And, like, and I was like, oh, of course. Like, no wonder I shall never attain to this sort of sound, because I do not have the strength of will to play cane reeds. You know? Yeah.
It's so much less difficult than people think, I think. But also, like, she's playing bellows driven pipes, so like, arguably they're gonna, I mean, that's why they're causing her trouble in Australia, if they're used to an ambient level of humidity. But I mean, that's the nice thing, and the frustrating thing about Uilleann pipes is, like, once the reed's in and working, like, you might have it for 30 years, but when it breaks, it's really broken, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And every time that you want to, if you do have to make adjustments because of humidity or whatever, like, kind of to make the adjustments, there's some really basic adjustments like pulling it in and out, but if you're going to actually touch the reed, I've heard somebody say, like, in order to get your Uilleann pipe in tune, you kind of have to be willing to break the reed to do it. Like, it's either you're either gonna fix it and it's gonna work, or you're gonna break it. And if you don't make adjustments like that, it might be a problem. But that could be wrong. Because of that, I've always erred on the side of, I'm just never gonna touch it, and when I'm out of tune, people are gonna have to deal with it. But sorry, she's great.
Mind its own. Yeah, she has excellent music.
I kind of love watching her play when she she just switches the tape between tunes depending on what key she's gonna play in. It's like, oh, that is a thing I never thought. Why don't we all just do this? Like, it's so great.
Yep. After seeing her do exactly that, I was like, I'm just gonna try that myself, and it was really fun. Like just for myself in my office, but being able to go just from like a modal or a minor kind of key to a major, like, oh, it worked really well. Awesome. I don't have to worry about this cross fingering stuff.
Yeah. Right.
Now, how long can I keep you, Jeremy? Am I pushing the limit already?
No, I mean, dude, like the doing a bagpipe podcast was partially because I miss talking about bagpipes. So at a certain point, I'm sure you're gonna have to like cut a bunch of things out, but I'm good.
Maybe not. Maybe not. Well, I wanted because I still have a lot of stuff I want to ask you about. You mentioned that in the '90s, getting into the clumsy lover, and it's interesting to me that you mentioned that because I wanted to ask you about the I think it was the Stool of Repentance.
Yeah.
So this tune first, I want to know about the tune a little bit, and because the reason it stood out to me is because like there is a movement in this song, in this tune that to me is like, did this tune inspire the Clumsy Lover? Like is this? It also feels kind of Gordon Duncan-ish to me, like, and maybe that's just that I'm hearing it through that lens, like a very modern piping listener, Then hearing this older tune goes, oh, it sounds like these modern things I've heard, And so maybe there's a direct line between them or a tradition that connects them, or maybe it's just disparate things, and this is just a cool thing you can do on pipes, and it always has been. So people did it a long time ago, and they do it today as well. But tell me about that tune.
Yeah. So first I have to. So some of what you're hearing. That sounds like it is because I was improvising.
Some of it was you.
Yeah, some of it was me, and that's definitely a piping tradition that I'm comfortable in.
Yeah,
but
don't
also
feel bad about that. I'm all for that. Yeah.
so one of the, like when I first restarted the podcast, I guess it would be like technically season 2. I was trying to come up with like kind of a more standardized, this is what each episode will be. And what I was doing then is I was playing through a Donald McDonald tune and a Neil Dickey tune, and generally singing something from the Scots Musical Museum from Robert Burns stuff. But it really started because so like Neil Dickey came out with that kitchen piping book, where Clumsy Lover is in, and in the introduction he kind of talks about like how restrictive the piping scene was, that you couldn't really play this kind of stuff. My understanding was like, yeah, you have to play it in the kitchen, because if anybody hears you, you'll be, you'll never win again. Yeah. And I was just kind of surprised looking at all the tunes in Neil Dickey's collection and seeing how similar there were tunes from the Donald MacDonald collections from 1828. And Donald MacDonald is like the first published source for Highland piping that has like all the embellishments and stuff in there, and does some small pipe, like small music, light music stuff, not just pibroch. So it's published in 1828. The cool thing about Donald MacDonald too, though, is his first pibroch collection, because he's sort of writing out music in a new way. The first couple pages are dance music, and he's saying these are the most popular dance tunes. And so, like, the point was that everybody knows how to play these tunes. So if you know how to play the Reel of Tulloch, then you can look at how I'm writing it and teach yourself how to read and write music this way. Yeah. And so for me,
it's like a Rosetta Stone for pipers.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, before I realized, like, oh, there's all of these other collections that are maybe not Highland piping, but you can tell there are Highland pipe like placements on it and that sort of thing. It was before I really knew about it, like William Dixon or about Robert Bremner or the Drummond Castle manuscripts and all these things that are older. That was a really important source for me. So anyway, looking through Donald MacDonald's tunes, I was always surprised at how similar they were to Neil Dickey stuff, and how like we think of kitchen piping as like a new invention, and arguably it was. Like they're doing something new because that tradition of dance music had basically died out. Yeah. I mean, people have done a lot of work to say like, it was continual in Cape Breton, and arguably like Australia too had some like continuing tradition stuff, but Highland piping very much switched to kind of military marches, pibrochs and stuff like that, rather than piping in the 18th century or earlier, where like, no, you're the loudest instrument, so you're the player for the dance. Like that's a good source for that kind of thing. And so I would just always compare that. So you do see those kind of high A disappearing note styles. You do see that in some older style of piping stuff. Yeah. And it was interesting to me. So Stool of Repentance is a tune in the William Dixon manuscript, which is a collection of tunes from 1733. And it was, people argue about this, but I'm very convinced by Matt Seattle's argument that this is a collection of a border piper, like a person from the borders that played what we call a border pipe or a lowland pipe or Northumbrian half-long or whatever today. And like you can see that all the tunes are all 9 notes, like they all sit very well in Highland pipes. There's some people that argue that it's Northumbrian small pipes, but I think I buy I buy that this is music for an open-fingered chanter. Anyway, but there's in the introduction to Matt's publication on the William Dixon manuscript, he has a couple like notes and anecdotes about things, but they talk about how that high A seemed to be important and kind of mean something to people listening to it, and might have like a greater importance, or it was just something that people like really, that stood out when pipers had a good high A, that people were like, oh yeah, you got to listen to him because of this. And I started thinking of that tune and like, okay, this high A, oh, there's some high A stuff in here. And I was thinking about, what do you call it, descriptive pieces. So there's several tunes, like Irish pipes are sort of known for like the Fox Hunter, or in the 18th century, there's a tune Hare and the Corn, or the Hens Concert, like all these tunes that sort of are performative Uilleann pipers impersonating things that you see. So the fox chase is easily the most famous of these, where you hear the horns of the hunters, you hear the fox kind of crying as it's been, eaten or, killed by the dog or whatever. Yeah. And so I was thinking about descriptive pieces and looking at Stool of Repentance again. And, the Stool of Repentance is this kind of Calvinistic thing in Scotland and other places too, but where you get yelled at by the parson or whoever is in charge, and they kind of sit you on this black stool and just harangue you in front of the congregation.
And I love the title. That's honestly, before I'd heard you play it, I was looking down the album tracks, and this is the first tune I listened to because I was like, that's a great title. Let's hear this one.
Yeah. And so and like so many of the tunes in William Dixon's collection, our body is all get out. Like the titles are clearly going out of their way to be innuendos or not even at all.
Yeah.
And so then this tune, The Stool of Repentance, and, Robert Burns has written about like how there's this hypocrisy of that process, where the parson is, holier than thou, yelling at you, even though everybody knows that they've done bad stuff, or just this act of public beratement is also in its own way kind of like sinful or something. And so I was playing that, and so I was playing it and thinking about that exchange. And so when I get to that part that seems the most animated, like that is the moment where the parson is like really just screaming his head off at the guy. That makes sense. And then right after that part, it kind of slows way down and starts playing the variations again as written, but slower. And then in my thinking of this as a descriptive piece, like the guy's realizing like, I don't care. Like the person that just got chewed out, like rather than feeling guilty about this is like, I am going to remove myself of worrying about this. And that's why it ends kind of, to me, the ending then kind of seems chipper and happy because he's not worried about getting screamed at anymore on the Stool of Repentance. But
I liked the tune already, but like that the music fits that story so perfectly. That gives it another layer, another reason to like it. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a good tune. It's a really good tune.
Yeah.
I keep on kind of wanting to, I don't know, it's one of the frustrating things about doing so many tunes every week is that like I don't keep any of them. Like they are, I learn them, I basically just sight read them and then move on to something else. And like imagining a world in which I'm doing a gig every once in a while again rather than the podcast, it's like, oh, I've really got to figure out some of these to like hold on
to and make them part of your repertoire, right?
Yeah, and that's sort of the nice thing about like the album Oyster Wives Rant is like, these are some of my favorite tunes, and I knew how to play them once. At least I know that.
Yeah.
Kind of a weird, definitely. I just got back from a couple long road trips driving to North Carolina and back a couple times for like family visits and weddings, and that's a really good stay awake thing is to have a recording of yourself playing a bunch of tunes, because you're just, because then you're just playing you're driving your steering wheel. Like it's right. It was way more stimulating than I thought. Like better than listening to podcasts or music is like music that you know how to play or sing along to.
Kind of dust them off.
Well, and it just like it's stimulating part of my brain to make me stay awake was really nice.
And there has been research done that I'm sure a lot of musicians have paid attention to that suggests that sort of rehearsing in your mind without your instrument in your hands is nearly, if not just as effective in a lot of ways as practicing on your instrument. And so it doesn't not yield benefits in terms of transferring to actual play either. Or so the research might indicate.
Yeah, I mean, you do that too, though, right? Like, do you play your steering wheel ever?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I play the steering wheel. I play my wife's hand when we're holding hands. Yeah, It wasn't long before she'd start just asking me like, "What tune you playing, sweetie?" Like, oh,
yeah. I had a brief, like not quite, but nearly relationship with another piper.
I've heard that's a bad idea. I don't know, but
Yeah, it didn't work out. But there's definitely part of me that was like, oh, that'd be kind of fun to like play tunes on one another and see if you could figure them out. But
right.
It was definitely one of the things I'm most proud. Like I knew it was cheesy when I was saying it, but we were exchanging tunes back and forth or something. And she said, "Oh, it's a really good burl. You've got a really good burl there." And I was like, "Babe, if you like my burl, you should see my Kronlua." It's just like it's such a stupid like, oh, there's so many dumb things you could say to one another.
Oh, the opportunities to say them are so limited. Oh, Mo, you know what? I've been thinking all through this interview, Jeremy, about asking you, like, not putting pressure on you, but asking you if you've considered possibly putting together a printable, like publishable book, of like favorite tunes with like blurbs, little pieces of information about the tunes and stuff like that throughout. Kind of like Timothy Cummings has done some of those. I love just like reading the books. I don't even have to play them, just going through and reading them. But now I'm thinking like maybe you should also publish a book of like Piper specific pickup lines. I think that's a very small market, but one that would very much appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm really, I do want to publish a collection of tunes, but not at all like me talking about them. I've been hoping to figure out a way to make um, just to print a bunch of tunes in the style that they would have been printed in like the 18th century, just like as a fake artifact or whatever. But I just, after spending so much time looking at these old collections, I really want to have something. I mean, I'm always kind of imagining like, yeah, I'm going to do gigs again where I'm generally talking about historic tunes, and it would be a fun thing to kind of sell.
Yeah, you say fake
also,
artifacts. Are you thinking like paper that would look period accurate and like typesetting that would look...
Yeah, the typesetting is the main thing,
Yeah.
and yeah, the typesetting. But that's sort of the rub is trying to figure out how to do it without it being obviously broken. You know, like to get the printing to look just imperfect enough without being over the top, like, you know, burned edges. I remember
right, you got the burnt edges thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I worked for the Park Service.
It's a Pirates tune, I see.
right. But I just got yelled at by this other piper, but this cool guy who he was totally right, but you know, there's this aspect of performing historicness or whatever. So I was writing these scripts that we would do during our big rendezvous at the park I worked at. And it was a bunch of reenactors that had no interest in like performance or acting or anything. And so I was like, well, if we're going to stay on message, y'all are going to need scripts. And so I printed them off, and like my boss was like, here, use this stuff. Or I was like, yeah, we're going to print it on yellow paper or whatever, so it looks like vellum or whatever. Yeah. And this guy's like, what the heck are you doing? That stuff only looks like that because it's old. We are supposed to be showing 1797. That would be white paper. Quit it with that. Don't keep that myth going.
You took it another step further, didn't you?
Yeah, I was like, oh, you're right. I feel
touche, sir.
Yeah. But,
now,
yeah, so that's my vision, but I don't know
I would love that. Now, and I'm curious, maybe, you know, because I don't know, but you know, you're deep in this history. What did printed music look like at the time? Were there typesetters for staff music in the same way there were for, you know, the Gutenberg press, right, where there would be letters, or was it a lot of it handwritten? Like, what was sheet music like?
Yeah, it's definitely printed. I don't know. I've never seen. They actually have. They have. I think they have some music blocks on display at the Piping Center in Glasgow, but it was not a thing I was interested in at the time, so I didn't pay terribly close attention. But yeah, it's definitely mass printed. Like the amount of printed music that was popular and showing up in the 18th and 19th century is huge. Like it's way more, and even the 17th century, you start to see quite a lot of it. And there's like a couple big names in it. So like Robert Bremner wound up printing a bunch of music, I think in Edinburgh or Glasgow first, but eventually moved to London. So a lot of the stuff that we use, like collection of Scots reels or country dances, are all printed by him. Before him, there's John Walsh, who's like a London-based printer that's printing a bunch of English tunes, and then I think he got the deal for Haydn, so he's publishing a bunch of Haydn music. Haydn or Handel, one of those two. I can never. One of them was not alive yet. But and then before Walsh, there's like the Playford, who kind of published. Playford's manuscripts are sort of the best known, but again, like a London-based publisher. But they all kind of look. They all kind of look the same, and they're mass printed.
Yeah.
And I was looking at a collection from the National Library of Ireland of like an Irish piper's family collection. It was really cool looking through and seeing this combination of where the piper was copying notes, like tunes out that he had heard somebody play, or copying them out from from another book. But then also this collection just also had like loose broadside stuff in there, sort of like any bagpipers, tune book, which winds up
like
with kind of
three-ring
loose
binder.
sheets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, there's clearly just a lot of this ephemera stuff kind of printed, and I spent a lot of time looking at broadsides for like ballads. I was really into Robin Hood ballads for a while, and so looking at all these old broadside sheets. And I just didn't realize like how much like the loose like sheet music was also kind of sold in that same vein. And you see it in advertisements for like in the United States in the United States or before then in the colonies too, which was sort of neat. I kind of got on a big Robert Bremner kick last fall. And his brother, so Robert Bremner is this music printer and musician, like I said, starting either in Edinburgh or Glasgow and wound up moving to London. But his brother, James Bremner, I think Robert certainly had, but James Robert might have, but James definitely was trained in Italy. Like this was sort of the norm. There were a couple music societies in Edinburgh that would pay you to go to Italy to learn from Oyster kind of thing. And so James Brunner did that, came back and kind of was looking for a better gig, I think, than what he was getting in Scotland. So wound up moving to Philadelphia. But that's the oldest Scottish tutorial on guitar comes from Robert Bremner, but it was almost certainly written by James Bremner, but it was just kind of published by Bremner. But you look through like ads listing kind of new stuff arrived in the stores, and it includes like lists of music by, we've got McGibbon's stuff in here, we've got Bremner, we've got Oswald's of tunes you could buy in Philadelphia or any of these big port cities in North America. So it's definitely something that people were starved for. We take for granted how easy and accessible music is now, that like you kind of have to be working at avoiding it if you don't want to hear music, because it's just everywhere. But before recorded music, you're just sort of spending a lot of time listening to yourself hum, so when you actually hear a musician or see some music, it's a really great thing.
And this is everything that you're describing is also just like adding to this like sort of mind-blowing epiphany, paradigm shifting experience I've been having throughout this interview, Jeremy, too. That like the way you're talking about sheet music as like this technology that can like connect us so efficiently to the past, you know. I don't know what the equivalent would be. Like I'm thinking maybe it's silly for me to draw the connection, especially for you as a historically minded person. You might think it's especially silly, but are you familiar with the book series The Last Kingdom?
I think so. Is that the Anglo-Saxon?
That's right. And Netflix did a series based off of it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's a character in there for whom literacy absolutely does not matter. And there's another character for whom literacy absolutely is the most important thing in the world.
Yeah.
And they have this conversation where one of them's like, that's stupid. Why would I do that when I can just go out and do this thing? I'll just do it, you know? And the other guy explains like, look, the written word is fascinating because it makes deeds and men immortal, right? Like this is the vehicle by which we are transported into the future. And I don't know, like the written word is so ubiquitous, and literacy is so ubiquitous especially for us in first world countries at present. Like, it's like a fish not knowing that it's wet, right? I'm just starting to realize like what an amazing,
we take it for granted.
Like what a technology to have these pieces of sheet music that you've been going through and then playing that I get to hear. It's like my ears are traveling back in time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And especially it's because instruments change in tonalities and playing styles. But like I said, it's an imperfect thing, but it's sort of the best we got. Yeah. But yeah, that idea of literacy being important. I was just the last couple of months or last bit of time here, I've been like helping out and participating in this Ojibwe language, language table thing. And so Ojibwe is a verb-based language, so it's really complicated. And they don't have gendered pronouns or gendered nouns where like things are male or female. But what they do break things down by is animate or inanimate is sort of how the language is organized. And lots of people always get frustrated. It's a talking point amongst most language students that book, Oyster is inanimate. And they're like, books should be animate because they do so much, they do all these things, they have to be animate. And it's like, well, no, you think about the first encounter with a book, like the person that made the word for Oyster, like that book didn't do anything for them. Like it was like it was not a thing. It's not a tool set that was important or valuable because people couldn't read or write at the time. Yeah. And like for the longest time, like in Canada, there's been some really cool work done about this of kind of understanding treaties. But in the United States and North America in general, like treaties are problematic because the written form of a treaty was one half of what that understanding was a lot of times. Yeah. The other half of that understanding was the person they're talking about it and explaining what's important, because that's how written things worked for lots of Indigenous people, where you'd have this object that represented an agreement or a story, and then you'd have somebody telling what's important and what their commitments to are around that. And for the United States government or British government, like they come in writing everything out in legalese, and like to them, what we say doesn't matter nearly as much as what is written down and our name is committed to, which is how it was super easy to be wildly disingenuous so long as you got people to sign things, and it was permanent because of the power that written written word in our legal system, which is a different topic than how great it is to look at 18th century music collections.
But it is interesting in how like also, and maybe I'm missing the point here, but like the idea from the colonist point of view that like because this document exists with this written word on it, the document is essentially immortal. It will live beyond the two people who are standing on either side of this table talking about the document. Whereas for a person for whom that written word isn't an immortal thing, it's a temporal agreement, potentially.
Right. And like as a historian, like that's definitely, we're constantly doing that, where you have to interpret these primary sources because they're written by somebody that had a wildly different culture, and the past is a foreign country idea. Like we've got to do some pretty serious work to understand what these things meant to them at the time, or like did they have the like. When I'm asking students to like analyze primary sources, one of the questions I always have is like, what information did the creator of the source not have in order to make these claims? Like, what didn't they know? Like, what is revealing in this record that kind of shows like, oh yeah, they didn't know what they're talking about. They couldn't have known this thing that they're claiming. Anyway.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sidetrack us too much. Let me see if I can get us back on track here. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Let's just hop into another tune. I'd like maybe you could tell me a little bit about Loch Ness. Is this one about a loch, about the monster? Like what's behind this? What's behind this tune?
Loch Ness is such a cool tune. It's from Robert Bremner, so it's good. We were just talking about him. So Robert Bremner's collection from I think 1757 is probably the oldest setting of this as that name. But recently, I've kind of realized, if you look on the album and listen to Loch Ness and then listen to Drummond Castle, they're the same tune.
Oh.
Like they're different approaches, but it's like, there's definitely a lot of similarities between those two things. And I didn't realize that at the time. And then beyond that, so the Drummond Castle setting is from 1736. This amazing kind of fiddler, dance master named David Young that has a couple of these really beautiful tune books that have survived today, and you get a good sense of like what music sounded like dance music in the 1730s and 40s from it. But yeah, Loch Ness and Drummond Castle are pretty similar. And then today, or at least in the 20th century, the tune is probably best known as Cutting Bracken, which is
of course. It seemed familiar. Yeah. Okay.
And again, I was just playing around with trying to play the bass line on Loch Ness. I was like, I'm going to use a low whistle, because a lot of these older like 18th century tune collections will have like a bass clef line to like play as an accompaniment. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to look at Loch Ness again because I know there's a bass line in there, and I did it, and I was like, well, this is kind of boring. I'm not sure that low whistle is the answer to this, and also a low whistle doesn't quite have the reach I need it to play most of the bass lines. But in playing through Loch Ness again, I was like, oh, that sort of sounds like Drummond Castle. Oh, that sort of sounds like Cutting Bracken. So they're all kind of related, but it's a cracking good tune. For me, the piper for like the fur traders, he was playing for Simon McTavish, was technically like who his boss was, and Simon McTavish grew up like a mile or two south of Loch Ness. And some ways, for the longest time, I was always looking for tunes that were from that area, or kind of said something like the title was about that place, so that I could talk about it, like if I was giving a presentation on historical tunes and why our piper was there on Lake Superior. which is sort of why I was fascinated with it. But yeah, I've had a recent epiphany of like, oh, this tune that's why I like it so much. It's all these other tunes.
I love it when that happens. I don't know. Are you familiar with the book that Fiona? Oh, what's her last name? She does that radio show. She put it. It's called Wayfaring Strangers.
Oh yeah, that tune
like
or
transatlantic.
that's
Oh yeah, I love the tune for sure. But
Yeah.
she put together like it's almost like a textbook about this like
cool.
transatlantic movement of music from the British Isles over into Appalachia and sort of this back and forth trade.
Yeah.
There's
no,
there's an
Sounds
introduction
great.
where Dolly Parton talks about sitting down with an Irish group to do some recordings and how like
that's great.
one group would start playing a tune and the other group would go, "Oh, I know that tune. It's this name."
Yeah.
And they're like, "No, it's not. It's this name." But they're
Yeah.
playing the same thing, you know?
Yeah, the Campbells are coming. That's a tune that shows up in a lot of American kind of old timey music.
I remember when I first encountered a post on Bob Dunsire that I think it was Aaron Shaw of the Wicked Tinkers had put it up that just described all the different titles that the Bride's Jig had gone by.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Bung Your Eye and Lord Dunmar or some lord's name, like just all these different names that I think that is fascinating when you
That's what's it's so cool. I mean, I don't like ABC notation. I much prefer looking at like the actual original printed sources from 18th century, 19th century.
Yeah.
But the cool thing about ABC notation is there's so much of it you can search. Like you can just search those things. So I don't know who is doing this kind of coding work, but I think that is how traditional tune archive has grown to be so robust, is people doing that. But yeah, you type in any title and it's just great. They'll have like links to all the other names that the tune has had across different traditions or different published examples of it. But
awesome. Well, I also want to play Robin Powers Fancy. I really liked it. You got whistle popping up a few times in this collection, and this was one of my favorites. And I'm curious if you were to pitch to a Highland piper why they ought to pick up the whistle, what would you say to them?
Oh, that's interesting.
Or would you even pitch it to them? Like, is it even something people need to do?
I'm struggling with this because whistle, yes, everybody should play the whistle. It's so easy and good. It's sort of a frustrating thing to me that in Ireland, like in the United States, you learn recorder as a kid, and recorder is a beautiful instrument. It's cool. I wish that I had taken it more seriously and still knew how to play it.
I believe you. I can't help kind of go, is it? But that's probably because most of my exposure is like first grade recorder classes.
Right. But like if you listen to, like I know maybe in first grade they showed us the good stuff too. But if you listen to like Renaissance recorder groups that are using more than just the recorder that everybody plays, it's really cool. But it's still kind of a tricky. Yeah, it's still kind of a tricky instrument. But in Ireland, rather than recorders, it's penny whistles.
Yeah.
It's such an easy instrument that has so much range, and it's like they're cheap.
So cheap. And way easier than a recorder, right?
I think so. Like it's a much more intuitive. Like the higher the open note goes, the higher higher the open hole goes, the higher the note goes.
Yeah.
And in terms of being able to play with other people, if that's ever a thing that's important to you, it's just so much easier than bagpipes to play with other folks and to not be so stinking loud. And it's just, and it's also like part of the tradition. Like Joseph MacDonald's, like the first printed book explaining how to play Highland bagpipes and pibroch specifically, he talks about whistles, like that Highland pipers are learning pibrochs on whistles. And he's not talking penny whistles, they didn't exist yet. He's almost certainly talking about like bark whistles, where you slip the bark off of a plant and, kind of do a DIY whistle until it breaks. But yeah, so it's definitely part of like the piping tradition that we've sort of just lost or ignored, and it seems like, oh, now I can go play at Irish sessions or something. But it's such a good tune, or it's such a good instrument. It's a pain to record. So if you're doing a lot of recording, just get ready to be frustrated with getting the microphone placement correctly and not popping. But yeah, it's less work too. Like, I don't know. I have a really crappy practice chanter with a questionable reed in it, so it's like more work to play my practice chanter than to play bagpipes in terms of pressure.
Yeah.
So it's just nice to like have a thing that's responsive and easy and everybody can play with.
That's maybe not a bad idea. If any pipers need like more motivation to get their pipes out, just set your chanter up such that it's so difficult to play your practice chanter that it's just easier to play your pipes.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm all these folks with digital chanters now. Like I
Back in my day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even back in my day, we had them. They're just always so expensive.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not going to spend $100. I mean, especially as a kid playing when I really could have used like more practice time and space.
Yeah.
There's so many things that I wish I bought kind of before I got married and started to think of like my life as an adult. My wife is like absurdly supportive of bagpiping endeavors, like to a fault. Like she let me buy this $2,500 chanter and didn't even make me feel the slightest bit bad about it. But there's still things like I'm not spending that kind of money on a digital chanter.
Yeah, I definitely look back at my teenage years, like when I had no responsibilities, and I'm like, what? I bought a lot of candy, pizza, and a longboard. Like I could have really loaded up, you know. Like I could have got a lot of equipment to last me the rest of my life.
Yeah, like if I had waited to buy Uilleann pipes until when I should have bought Uilleann pipes, I would never have them. You know, like it's good that I impulse. So as much as I'm like Highland pipers should not start with full sets. It's like, well, you know, there's something to be said for spending the money when you have it, and aren't being as responsible as you might be.
Right, something to be said for just diving in and not thinking too hard, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I liked, and the other thing that's nice about it is whistles are a good change of pace. So like that's why I've got whistle tunes kind of dotted in throughout the album, was just to sort of break up the monotony between Highland pipes and Uilleann pipes, or to kind of serve as a break. And Robin Power's Fancy is just a cool tune. This setting comes from O'Farrell's Pocket Companion. I was trying to look up like any more information on it, and I couldn't really find anything other than it's cool to see pipers sort of copy one another. So Fitzmaurice, who is, so remember, O'Farrell's an Irish piper in London, Fitzmaurice is an Irish piper in Scotland. I can't remember if it's Edinburgh or Glasgow. But Fitzmaurice's book comes out shortly after O'Farrell's, and he has got Robin Power's Fancy in there, nearly note, I think it is note for note, the same. But Fitzmaurice, like playing around for a lot of aristocracy and like wealthy people. And so his name is sort of revealing of that different, just that different, what am I thinking here? Just different people.
Robin Power? Is that?
Yeah, he's playing for somebody that isn't Robin Power. So this is Miss Elphinstone's Fancy is what Fitzmaurice has it as. But I don't know. And then there's another setting called Raymond's Frolic from some other source from much later. But yeah, it's a good tune. It's a good tune for kind of breaking up the monotony of bagpipes.
Mind me continuing to throw questions at you. What?
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Can you point to any specific thing that drew you to, like, we're talking a lot about the 18th century and early 19th century. Like, what is there any specific thing that's drawn you to this time period, musically and otherwise, with your reenacting work and stuff like that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because it's sort of, one of the most empowering things I've ever heard from a historian that generally is not a particularly empowering person. She can sort of be mean, has a reputation for being mean and vindictive, so I'm not going to say her name. But she one time said, we were talking about what I was interested in or what I was studying, and she said, well, you like what you like. You know, you can't really help what your focus is going to be. Like, that has to be what, like, the thing that you wind up being sort of obsessed over is what you've got to follow as a historian. And like, for me, it has turned into the 1790s, and that's just the way of it. And it kind of, it's a reverse engineering thing. It's because, you know, when I was 18, I started working as a park ranger at a site that showed 1797, and started just focusing really in hard on the late 18th century. And there's some really interesting things about that era. For me, conveniently, it's a time period that not a ton of people care that much about. Conveniently as a historian, inconveniently as having a pretty niche bagpipe podcast that like focuses in on this time period that not a lot of people care about. But like, as a kid, I was super into the Jacobite Rebellion. Didn't really do much serious research other than like buying the Osprey Men at Arms book of like for that war gamers buy to be able to paint costumes somewhat more accurately. And like that was interesting to me. Kind of fit in this kind of American idea of what Scotland's supposed to be in rebellion and all this kind of jazz. And I think the more I became aware, like as a historian, about how the world worked and just how connected everything was, the 1790s became really interesting because it is this kind of really, it's this transitional moment, I guess, between kind of industrial revolution and you know, the clearances, like all these things that are happening in the 1790s make for a really messy and interesting history. And then on top of that, you've got like a world war happening in Europe that's clearly affecting how things are happening. But for print media and for music, it is like O'Farrell. God, everything just comes back to O'Farrell. But like, you can see in his collection of tunes, like I think his first book maybe comes out in 1800, which is a Tudor, and then within 10 years or maybe 15 years, the other books come out. But you see just how mixed up everything is. And the more I study like earlier music collections, it's clear that things were pretty mixed up before then too, that there was quite a few musical influences, but yeah, it's just it's a cool sounding music to me. Like country dances from the 18th century sound really cool, and kind of Baroque music, or Baroque, I guess. But I like it. I like it all. Just a dumb answer, but like, I just like it all. I think the other thing I like about it is things are being mass produced, sort of, but not really yet. So there's still, like, the late 18th century has a lot of handmade quality right alongside the first kind of mass-produced things where everybody's going to have a similar blanket or a similar, you know, accessories, but you still have a lot of space for homemade items. So like the material culture is really interesting to me. Might be part of it too, but yeah, for doing Indigenous history, the 1790s are nice because it was like this in Lake Superior anyway. It was at the stage of relationships between Indigenous people and colonizers where it isn't painfully obvious how bad it's going to go. And the Ojibwe, like the folks that I mostly study and like the language I speak, is all like they were still very much in control of things and pretty powerful because there was, you know, out there anyway, there were still there was different fur trading companies, different European powers, so you could kind of negotiate and play people off one another. It's also a really interesting time because of, you know, the expanding United States. You start to see refugees, people that are like fleeing and relocating because of the Northwest Territory Indian Wars, kind of in Ohio and Indiana, where Ojibwe people and Ottawa people are kind of getting further and further west. And so it's a really interesting time for a lot of different people mixing together. And for me, any place, I always said Grand Portage was like the perfect place for me to work because I got to talk about Ojibwe history, Scottish history, fur trade history, and play bagpipes. And there's not a lot of places where those things perfectly align.
This
and
was the delta for you.
Yeah. And like I sort of felt that way too. And when I was doing my comprehensive exams for my PhD, which I'm still, like, I'm just a candidate, haven't written the book yet, but I was just kind of shocked, spending so much time in North Carolina to visit my wife's family and stuff, and just always had an interest in kind of the history of slavery and enslavement, and realizing that there was this history field where you could talk about Indigenous history, kind of colonial American history, and slavery and Scottish history, and it's like that was a legitimate thing. It always felt like I had too many hobbies and wasn't focusing on anything, but realizing that like the history of the Atlantic world was a thing where I could do all of that stuff. But the 1790s are kind of an interesting time for that, with like the Haiti slave revolt or Haiti rebellion and that sort of thing too. So
yeah,
I don't know. It's a cool time, but I think really any time period is interesting if you look at it long enough.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
But, yeah.
No, it is really interesting, and it. I mean, I've been curious about that anyway because like I'm by no means a historian, but my wife was a history major and has done some research work and stuff like that, and she. She'll be upset with me that I don't remember exactly. She was doing women's history in a certain time period that I think was probably included the late 1700s, partly because of course she loves Jane Austen, right? Like, of course she does, right? Like, and so do I. And this is part of what I've really enjoyed about listening to some of your music. Some of these, in fact, it definitely comes up in the Stool of Repentance. I hear these movements, in these like dancey tunes.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not strictly a dance tune, but it feels dancey to me. That I kind of go, oh, like my wife and I go to these like Regency gatherings. Well, when we can, when COVID isn't happening and stuff.
Right.
And so they'll play period accurate music, and it's like I can hear. It's like this. What am I trying to describe? Like up until recently, my experience with bagpipes has been very much against a backdrop of military regimental style music. And aside from that, I was also being exposed to some of this sort of Regency era social dance music, but on other instruments. And so your podcast has provided this really cool way for me personally to go like, whoa, my worlds are colliding here. This is fun.
Yeah. Yeah, you can do those things. They did those things, like, I wind up playing out of a lot of country dance collections, and a lot of country dance collections pull heavily from folk traditions of Scottish and Irish music and English music. And so they wind up being pretty good. I love that. I love that stuff. I love the sound of that. I've had this episode that has been like half recorded for a year, maybe at this point, about Bath, because there's sort of an interesting history of piping and pipers at Bath, and it's clear to me. I'm pretty sure that O'Farrell traveled to Bath and performed there. I know that other pipers did. It's sort of weird now. In the Bath Cathedral, there's part of it is decorated with like little angels playing bagpipes.
Oh, I didn't
but that's
know that.
like in the 20th century. That's been added in there.
Oh.
And there was an instrument seller kind of right across the street from the cathedral that sold bagpipes, that advertised as selling bagpipes. And I've been talking with, part of the reason it's kind of taking forever is there's all these loose threads that I've kind of pulled at and forgotten about, and haven't been sure how to talk about it. But the Duke of Argyll, when he went to Bath, he brought a bagpiper with him. So like that would be a big thing, like to have this arrival. And I was just looking at newspaper.
Like his personal piper, like to like announce his
I'm
arrival.
I'm not sure that the Duke of Argyll had a personal piper at that point. I guess he probably has.
Maybe he just hired one though to like, you're coming with me to Bath.
Yeah, but
grab
when
some spare reeds.
right. But when I was looking around, I was just poking around at newspaper kind of archives, and in the Bath papers a lot of times, because it's such a destination of people coming to Bath and that sort of thing. So they print like who's arrived, and I haven't heard back from Keith about it. But I was just kind of randomly searching for some paper and reading through it, and they have arriving the Duke of Argyll and also O'Farrell, but they don't say O'Farrell the piper. There's no ads about O'Farrell there to perform. Right? You kind of wonder if like, oh, did the Duke of Argyll pay for O'Farrell to come up, or was it just a coincidence? Was there another dude named O'Farrell?
Could this have been early in O'Farrell's career? I guess you would know by when he.
Yeah, it would have been kind of late later in his career. Well, after his books were published anyway. Yeah. O'Farrell is such a funny cat. Like I keep on meaning to do an episode about this too, but he advertised like his ability to play Irish pipes and to teach people how to do it. And like, there's this famous story, I think it gets attributed to Seamus Ennis sometimes, about it taking 21 years to learn how to play the Irish bagpipes.
I've heard that one, yeah.
And or 21 years and 7 generations or 7 years. I don't remember all of it, but there's this funny thing where O'Farrell is taking out ads saying that he could teach a gentleman how to play the Irish bagpipes in like 3 weeks. Like it kept on. I don't have it quite in my head anymore, but like the length of time.
21 years.
Yeah, the length of time kept on getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Like, man, he is confident. And then finally, one of the ads, he says, "If you already play German flute." Like, oh, well, yeah. So you're just teaching bellows at this point.
Yeah, insert some fine print there.
Yeah.
Well,
but yeah, those
your
dance tunes are so cool.
When your Bath episode comes together, I'm gonna make sure Judy Barker gets a link because I know she lived in Bath for a while. I bet she'd be interested.
Oh yeah. It's cool tunes. I mean, one of the things I'm weirded out about it kind of has to do with women's history. One of the tunes for that episode is "Saw You a Woman of 15 Years," which is like on its own isn't particularly scary sounding. But then when you like look up the ballad, like, oh, that's grotesque. I don't really know how to talk about that.
When you find the lyrics that go with the title, it's like, oh yeah, it's the worst thing I possibly could have imagined being attached to the title.
And it's like one of these weird moments of like this argument that people make that you can't judge people in the past based on today's standards. There's a way that argument is made that seems really disingenuous.
Yes. Yeah.
Or just not well thought out. Because like so many of the things that people say, oh, you can't judge them on that. You know, people at the time all felt that way. Like people at the time all felt that way so long as you continue to ignore the voices of the people that said no, that's not good. But yeah, so like there's this, like obviously there's a normalcy amongst like wealthy and powerful people to, you know, have relationships, like even marrying teenage girls. But it's like, oh, that seems like a thing I should know how to talk about more before I actually do the episode because it does seem so tied into it. But the same idea of like, oh, we can't judge slave owners because that was what it was like for the time. Like, well, you know, enslaved people didn't want to be enslaved.
Even then, believe it or not.
Even then. And then, like, anytime you say that, they'll bring up, well, there is this one slave revolt where the slave owner, like, the slaves wound up owning slaves. So, you can't say that. Like, geez, you got that one example that breaks it all, I guess. And the main thing, too, like, you hear people say that with Indian removal, like, when... like the Trail of Tears and all that stuff. Like, oh yeah, you can't judge them for that. That was that was just the way of it. Like literally, the Supreme Court said you can't do this. It's wrong, and they did it anyway. So like to say that everybody went along with the thing ignores it. It always winds up ignoring the voices of Quakers or the Supreme Court in that case, or you know, all kinds of people.
Don't the Quakers like show up throughout history so often, seeming to like have got things right? Like I'm often surprised, like, oh yeah, there was a voice of reason, and there was a Quaker. Well, look at that.
Yeah, somebody did a good thing, and it just happened to be a Quaker. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and is that one of the complicating factors about like being passionate about at any time period, that like you will find sort of messy, unseemly things, and it's like your passion makes you want to, like, it's like this complicated enthusiasm for the period mixed with the sort of repugnance of some things that people might have said or done at the time.
Right. Like, yeah, the going to the past to find heroes is that's an exercise in ignoring some things. Like you're going to have to ignore some things, and makes it sort of a fraught enterprise. Like I don't know that you should. Like there's been a meme going around lately that if you are upset because if you're upset because you're studying history, if you think studying history you shouldn't be upset about things, you're not actually talking about history. Like that's the ideally, like if things are good, if we are all succeeding, if we look to the past and see things that bother us, that probably means we're doing better. Like like we should hope to, you know, progress towards a more fair and balanced society than what things were when there were such extreme power dynamics that you could literally own people and their family. Like we should hope to be moving beyond that.
We should hope that arc is slowly bending toward justice, right?
Yeah. So it's weird. History's a weird thing, and it's like there was recently a study coming out about how historians are can tend to be traumatized by like the periods they study. And
but makes sense.
I don't know that I'm traumatized, but I'm certainly jaded. Like I don't know. And I feel bad about it. Like studying Indigenous history, it's a long dark history of, and there again, it's bad to look to the past and see something good, but it's really hard to like compare Indigenous history kind of prior to colonization to how things are going now and not see like, oh, that might have been nice. Like maybe it does seem like it's better. But you know, there was obviously problems with that too. I just always kind of wish could have seen, like where certain, because like Indigenous folks are obviously around, and that culture has continued to grow and change because of colonization. I just kind of wish I'd love to see like what Ojibwe culture looked like without colonization at this point of like progressing and changing without this kind of genocidal influence right next to it all the time. But definitely tangent.
These fun alternative histories. I remember encountering one that I thought was interesting that speculated what would the 20th century look like if Germanic and Norse peoples had populated North America and the Aztec Empire had thrived.
Sure.
It's a fun thing to imagine, right? Yeah.
It'll look good.
It's not necessarily a better future than what we currently have, you know. And so, but it is interesting, and that's an interesting aspect to the work you do, you know, that I hadn't really thought of before. Like, to what degree is it tempting to just sort of wish that you could just have the notes on the page and not have to think about the title or the context in some cases?
Oh, I mean, the context is always the fun stuff anyway. Like, as much as the reason that I haven't been sure how to talk about Saw You a Girl of 15 is not because it's not because I wish I didn't have to talk about it, because it's a really good tune. It's because like I want to figure out how to talk about it, how people talk about it, and I'm still not sure. And it's, you know, because that relationship. I mean, I think in the United States anyway, like it took a really long time for me to even hear the term femme couvert. Let alone like understand what it meant, that like, oh no, women are literally invisible in the law, and like didn't have any sort of rights until like absurdly recently. And so yeah, it was normal for powerful men to marry 15-year-olds or to take advantage of 15-year-old girls or 14-year-old girls. So I shouldn't be critiquing this body ballad. And it's also a body ballad. Like, it's a broadside of guys just talking. You know, it's like it's the quintessential locker room chat except bathroom chat. But it's still feels like a thing we should talk about, because by like continually ignoring that stuff and not talking about it, we're just pretending like we're not kind of still living in the consequences of it, or the ramifications of it. And yeah, I guess that's where I'm at still. Is like, well, I was kind of bummed out because I went using like all the historian tools I knew of to like, I assumed some much smarter person than I would have written an article talking about this, but I hadn't found it yet to kind of have an idea of what to say. But
yeah, my wife laughs at me increasingly often. Like, I would like to think that I'm an enlightened and egalitarian person, you know, and that like I'm aware. I'd like to think that, but it's discouraging how often, discouraging and also sometimes exhilarating, just how often my paradigm shifts and I go, oh, I never saw that before. And it's very often around things like, you know, basically the mistreatment of women and how lucky I am, you know. And I'll come to my wife with these epiphanies and be like, sweetie, I just realized like this piece of language or this bit of history, you know, like this is still having ramifications today, or this would have been really hard. And she just looks at me and goes, yeah. You just figured this out?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It's so hard. Like, those are important. Like, having those epiphanies are something we should all aspire to. I feel bad in a way. Like, I moved around quite a bit as a kid, but, you know, still wound up in high school at the same place, and just seeing all the people that like never left the town that went to school in, and just don't have all those experiences. Like, if you're not exposed to the idea that, oh, there's a different way of looking at the world than your exact surroundings and point of view, it's really hard to have those epiphanies. Especially the older you get, like, there's this sense, it's like there's a sunk cost fallacy about your worldview. Like, oh no, I have believed this thing for 20 years, even though I am staring at something that is patently, like, is obviously demonstrating that that's not accurate. I better hold on to the 20 years that I've got invested in this. And the whole lifelong learning thing is is good, but also hard.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I hope that you can find a good way to talk about that tune, because I'd love to hear it along with anything else you can produce. Now a lot of your music is looking at the past, but I did have a lot of fun listening to you try to do some John Coltrane on the Lindsay System Chanter. So like, what about stuff post 19th century? Like, do you have tune books you really like, or things that you're working on, or stuff that draws you in?
Yeah, it's so funny. Like I used to like I've got Gordon Duncan's the books that the Gordon Duncan Trust put out.
Yeah.
And just loved playing through that stuff. Listening to Lincoln Hilton, I'm like, oh, I'm an old man now. My fingers can't do that anymore.
Lincoln Hilton, man, I love him so much, and in some ways he's like what's the word for it? Like he's so handsome. He's
Sure,
young,
yeah.
and he's got such great media quality, and his fingers move so lightning fast and so clean. It's like a machine that has a heart, And it's like I'm so overboiling with like jealousy, envy, but also admiration. So it's like there's no anger, but like I'm just trying to be honest. Like I've got a mixture of feelings going on every time I watch his stuff, and I can't stop watching it.
Well, I remember, maybe this is a joke, and I'm still out of it, but I remember like in the aughts or something, somebody posted a joke about burl oil. That all the best pipers. It was like an April Fool's joke. Yeah, that like if you really want to be good, you've got to use this lubricant on your fingers.
I don't remember that, but I like the joke already.
And it was a joke. I think Lincoln sells it. Like I think it is real, and
No
maybe
way.
it's an April Fool's joke that he did again.
I'm going to modern piping right now.
Yeah, I mean it might not be called burl oil, but like this idea of lubricating up your fingers to snap faster and all that stuff.
Well, and the other thing though is that he's got the chops. That honestly.
Right.
If he took anything that I previously thought wasn't a real thing and he said, no, I do this, I'd be like, okay, sign me up.
Yeah. Well, I remember when Mark Saul was first, it's sort of funny that these folks are all from like Australia, New Zealand and stuff. But but when Mark Saul first came out with like the Uilleann and Hell Down Train or Steam Train in Malag and all that stuff, there was a lot of old school pipers who are like, that's not real. He's editing it to speed it up because that's not a thing you can do. And like Mark Saul's stuff, I've got his books too. Like I could play all of that. I loved it. It was cool. The problem with it, and I think Lincoln's stuff too, is it's not particularly good as a solo thing. It's really great for like having an ensemble of people playing.
Right.
But he had one tune that I found the music for and I liked his playing. I can't remember what it was, but I looked at it and I started playing. I'm like, no, I can't do that. Like I can't actually play that way.
My body doesn't do that. I don't have that feature.
Yeah, and I've gotten I've become a way better piper in the last year. But it's also like a way better piper in the specific way. But there's this way that I feel like my path has diverged. When I first started piping, I wanted to play Clumsy Lover and all this stuff, and the perk of pipe bands where everybody's got to play the embellishments exactly the same way is you start to think of those embellishments like you can realize at speed how they become musical. And certainly in like 18th and 19th century sources, 19th century sources, you see that too. But it's different. It's at a different level now. And even like looking at the two different versions of a tune that Donald MacDonald printed, like one in 1828, one in 1838, he's got different embellishments for it. Like it's understood. Like, yeah, you can do what you want. Is sort of how I take it. But by always being so consistent in doing it, the chirping sound of that grace note becomes the embellishment in itself, right? And that's not a style of play that ever really interested me, and so it's not something that I've honed. And my fingers just rebel at it. Like, I've got to, in order for this tune to work. I think it was like you hold a B and just do a D grace note over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah. And I was like, no, can't do that. And it doesn't sound musical to me. Like I think generally
that stuff too.
Yeah.
I've tried to copy him. Like I can't do it. Like
yeah.
I can't.
I think generally, I think there's this. Since getting this new Uilleann pipe chanter, I have slowed way down in my playing, and there's always that stage of like when I'm young or had a hard read. Like when you have a hard read, you play fast. Like there's something that goes on in your brain. Like, well, this is hard. I better get through it. Yeah. That you have to unlearn. But like getting this, I didn't realize quite how much reeds, instruments kind of impacted how you play. and then getting this new tenor that just sounds so amazing and is nice and soft to play, I just like really slowed way down in my playing, and I much prefer the music, the musicality of it. But then there's this other, I feel like a lot of Lincoln stuff, like it's the opposite, like you need to play it to speed for it to sound right.
Like it's a face melting guitar solo, and it's impressive at its speed, but if it were slowed down, it actually wouldn't be that impressive, or wouldn't have the same charm or something.
Yeah, but so I don't know. So Lincoln stuff is beyond me. It's a thing I enjoy to listen to every once in a while, but it's not it quickly became clear like I'm actually not interested in trying to play that. But Gordon Duncan stuff is also like technically challenging. But what I loved about Duncan stuff is like he did it differently. Like he's using. I mean, and he learned so much like from that Irish repertoire and style of play of like, yeah, we're just all playing this tune together, but you kind of do different things with it. And it's kind of one of the things I love about, looking at those tune books compared to, because I'm not sure if Gordon did this with all of his albums, but in one of his albums, he like published all the tunes in the book when you first bought it. I think it was Pressed for Time. And so you had all the sheet music for the tunes, and then compare it to how he actually recorded it. Like, oh yeah, there's really no similarities there, or there's similarities, but there's a lot of differences. Anyway, yeah. So modern piping tunes are cool. I feel less interested, and awkwardly right now, my favorite new collection of tunes is from this piper from the Borders, or from Northumberland or Northumbria, named Uilleann Gelston, who's just clearly the best border piper around right now. And he plays Northumbrian small pipes and border pipes, and it just sounds amazing. His instrument's amazing too. It gets up to the second octave pretty well, but he plays in this way that isn't how like most border piping that you listen to is, like Fred Morrison or any other hotshot piper like Ross Ainsley, who are playing Highland pipes on a border pipe tuner, rather than actually playing the music of that tradition. And so it's not quite as fast. And I really love it. It sounds so much like, and it just looks so much like these 18th century tunes, and I like the musicality of it. But the funny thing is, like, Uilleann just put out a collection of tunes that he wrote, and I don't generally buy new collections of music, but I bought it.
That's not
like,
exactly your thing, huh?
I love all of these. But again, he wrote brand new tunes very much in an 18th century style, so it's like it's a toss up. But yeah, I don't know. I'm one thing too is I'm surprised at just how much music there is. Like I wouldn't, if I asked, when I first wanted to play 18th century or 19th century bagpipe music, I would have assumed, I did assume that there was like, in terms of resources, there's probably like 2 books to look at, as opposed to like, I've got at this point my like notes page for like, so all those footnotes or whatever that show up in the show notes for a podcast episode, link to the collections.
Yeah.
And I have one big long file for season 4 and one big long file for season 5, and both of those documents are 40 pages or more.
Oh man.
And granted, there's links to the same collection multiple times, but I've got it's like, there's like a lifetime of work to just play through all of the tunes that would have been played by pipers in this medium, which is sort of surprising. There's so much music. That's sort of why I quit trying to write tunes when I was younger. It was like, there's already so many tunes to learn. What can if Donald MacLeod wrote so many tunes, what can I possibly hope to bring to this by writing original music? But
yeah, it's interesting to me that like I feel like I'm seeing a parallel in my own experience, that like I started piping at 14, so a bit older than you did, but just like for the last few years I've been sort of like coming to this realization, or coming to like accepting this fact that like as a child playing bagpipes, just like with everything else for a child, it's unlimited potential. It's like, well, someday I will learn that, someday I will do that, someday I will have that, and I'm reaching a point now where I'm like just accepting and being okay with the fact that like I will never be able to do that. So like where I was younger, it was like, it might be like, I love this person's piping and I'm going to play like them. There's a slight shift to go, man, that person's amazing, and not have to tack on, and I would like to learn to, I'd like to, but like a shift to appreciation for appreciation's sake, not for like aspiration as well.
Yeah. I think that's good, right? Like, that's totally, that's a healthy place to be. As a kid, I wanted to be a grade 1 piper. That was really important to me. And then I competed once, or maybe I think I competed 3 times. Like, nope, that is not a thing I care about. I'm not gonna. And it seemed like impossible. And I didn't. Yeah, it seemed impossible, and it's sort of funny. I always wonder how much of my uh, behaviors and interest in music is like just justifying that decision not to
Yeah.
not to do that. And I had this weird moment where the pipe major of that Minnesota band that I was in college, like he and I were, he was maybe a little bit better than me. He was certainly better than me in being able to play a tune exactly the same way every time. But like musicality wise, we were pretty neck and neck.
Mm-hmm.
And he started competing, and he started competing grade one. I was like, oh, so like I could, oh, I should try. No, I'm still not going to do this. Like this is still not a thing I care
So now
about.
you know you could, but you don't really want to. It's
Yeah.
you honestly don't want to.
Yeah, because it's not. I feel bad because it's, you know, looking at like honestly, probably your podcast probably has more listeners than mine does.
I don't know about that, man.
But like I'm doing a wildly different thing. Like there's a lot of pipers in the world, and they all come from this pipe band world. Like
Yes, it's true.
like pipe band competition.
Yeah.
And like yeah, I've been around for a long time here and there, but like I've never actually talked too much about competition or
It's like,
band.
what's that guy talking? It's not. He's not talking about MSRs. I don't need to hear it.
Right. And that's fine, but it's just interesting to me, like yeah, that's not a realm, that's not a thing I've dabbled in, or it hasn't been important to me. I sort of lost my train of thought there.
Well, let me pick it up while you look for it. Let me just insert this, that like I have wondered before, even in this conversation, like to what degree have we been seeing over the last few years a shift that's like it might feel like it's going to something entirely new, but does it not feel kind of like the piping tradition used to be wider and bigger and more open, and it kind of became restricted into this sort of regimented, and maybe this is just my own experience, so this is what I'm seeing, right? But it became slowly regimented and militaristic and like sort of boxed in, and now we're kind of it feels like we're finding new things, but if we look closely enough, we're actually rediscovering things that used to be.
Right. I mean,
instruments as well as styles, like the Uilleann pipes coming back is one of the things. Like they almost disappeared from the earth, you know.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean that's definitely true.
Like, do you remember that article that would you pronounce her name for me again? The one who did the album,
Breacha?
Yeah,
Breacha Campbell.
Yeah, she got some attention for that awesome that real the Chantarant guys called it a real rock and roll response when somebody had seen one of her videos small piping, and they said, I hope she doesn't give up. I think it was serious piping, you know, meaning competitive Highland piping, right? And she said, define serious piping. Right? Yeah. Like, are we seeing like a more of an awakening and opening up to like, no, let's explore these other corners, you know, and like
let's let this thing be a musical instrument. Yeah. I think, one of if you haven't listened to Mark Saul's Mixolydian album, one of the tracks has like a voiceover, some pipe major, sort of. I think pipe major. I'm not sure who it is, but talking about how we should really kind of think of this as an instrument that plays, like it doesn't have to just be a bagpipe, it can be a musical instrument or something along those lines. But yeah, I mean that was definitely my realization in looking at Donald McDonald's stuff or Angus Mackay's stuff. Like all of this new tradition of kitchen piping is something that's already existed. Like that this was already a thing, and it's clear. Like I think Highland pipes would have died out or would have certainly become less popular than what they are if it weren't for the competitions and for the military. Yeah. So there's part of me, it's like, oh, well, we're obviously indebted to this. Yeah. But if you read, I think John Gibson, I can't remember what his first name is, but he's got a couple really awesome books about the history of Gaelic bagpiping. And he points out, like, from day one of those bagpiping competitions, there were people that hated them, that said, what are you doing? You're ruining the music. Yeah. This is not how this music is supposed to be performed. And I think there's some other things that I haven't read yet, kind of talking about like what a recruitment tool the various Highland societies were in London and in Scotland to kind of drive people towards the military and kind of really focusing on, you know, this militaristic use of the instrument rather than it being used to play dance tunes. And there's also this weird, I'm really struggling here to hold these threads together yet, but there's also this interesting phenomenon where like Highland pipes are the bagpipe of the world now. Like everybody thinks bagpipe and Highland pipes. Yeah. But probably the time period that I think a lot of people interested in this stuff kind of fetishize the 1740s, like before the Jacobite Rebellion, and kind of have this idea that there was a fully formed Highland culture where everybody played bagpipes and all this stuff, which is not really accurate. But it seems likely that in that 1740s period, there was more people playing Lowland pipes than playing Highland pipes, like just in terms of number of instruments that existed. Like Keith Sanger gave a really interesting talk about just how much a Highland bagpipe cost in, kind of the 18th century, and how it's like a year's or two's wages to like be able to do it, which is why it was so much tied to like this bardic tradition of, a family's piper, a wealthy family that could support a piper, because it's expensive even to get the instrument from in the first place. It's all quite a bit. It's all kind of complicated and interesting, and but I think thinking of bagpipes as having to be separate from it, it's clear that bagpipers, like Donald MacDonald, is copying out tunes that were being played for 100 years before, at least in Scotland, or maybe not 100 years. Yeah, 100 years. 1730s is when David Young publishes the Drummond Castle manuscript. And you see a lot of tunes that will show up later in the Highland bagpiping collections, and they're being played by fiddlers and things. So, like, you don't just have to play marches and stuff. Like, this was all a really robust collection of music that, pipers, just like Gordon Duncan plays Thunderstruck, a Highland piper in the 1740s is going to play the tune that David Young is famous for if he can do it. It's pop culture at the time. Man, every once in a while I come out of one of these long rants where I'm like, I have no idea where we started or what I'm talking about.
It's holding my attention, so it's bound to. You got at least one listener here, man. So carry on. Because I'm hopeful, and maybe it's only my own experience, but I feel like looking around right now, there are a lot more competitive Highland pipers that I know in my immediate vicinity who also own some form of small pipes than was the case 10 years ago. So I'm like, maybe we're seeing a collective shift, right? Like a turning back to this kitchen piping tradition, back to dance tunes, maybe we are seing that.
Yeah.
And that would be exciting.
It's such good music. Like, a 6/8 march is awesome, a 2/4 march, like I love a good 2/4 march to the point where I'm afraid to play them because I want to, the 91st or 90 whatever at Modern River is like one of my favorite tunes ever that I'm just totally afraid to play because I want to always do it justice. But like, I love a reel and a jig. A jig, man, they're good stuff. Yeah. Like just playing a variety of music and And it's sort of weird. That was the big point. The big epiphany I had, I was talking with a buddy of mine that's been a really big supporter of the podcast, and he's been in the piping scene since maybe the 80s or something, maybe even longer than that. But we were kind of talking about how competition, what it means to people, and how so many people are interested in it, and realized, and just the way, it's pretty unique, Highland bagpiping competition where, it's the same people competing to win the same prizes year after year after year after year.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's like the only thing that there's not really an equivalent music tradition of that. It's sports. It's just sports. Yeah. It's not a music competition. It's a sporting competition about music. And that's, and sports are fun. People get into sports, unless you don't. So, right. But it really helped my understanding of sports are really important to people, just like Highland bagpiping competitions and that sort of thing. But
yeah, here locally, we even use, here in the Western United States Pipe Band Association, we even use a service called R2 Sports to manage all the, signing up for competitions and everything like that. Because of course that's the model that makes sense, because that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of love in Ireland, they have competitions and festivals and stuff where people compete, but you definitely get the sense that once you win it once, you don't compete again.
It would be bad form to do so, right?
I think, I don't know. I don't know. Right, but I'm always kind of surprised when you hear about people competing, or it's like, oh, why didn't Porg McGovern compete? He was judging it, he won it before. Right. Right. There isn't the same thing. Whereas the idea of somebody winning the Glenfiddich or whatever that isn't Roddy McLeod or Stuart Little or Jack Lee, it's it's got to be one of those guys. Well, maybe they've already won once, and I don't know.
Or in some of their cases, several times.
Yeah. Right. I don't know. I think this. Yeah, it's a whole different thing, and the constant creeping up of the chanter stuff.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
That is weird, man. Super weird.
Yeah, my wife often comments on it's an inherently weird thing to judge art, to say we're now going to compete with art.
Technical difficulties.
I had read some speculation from somebody, or an idea, that possibly part of the reason the Highland bagpipe is like the bagpipe is partly because there are other kinds of bagpipe that have been developed all over the world, but as the Highland pipes moved out with colonialism, they started to replace what you might call indigenous bagpipes in different places in the world. And so, like, as that's happening, also sort of more classical instruments are replacing the pipes in parlor music in Europe. And so, like, you have these multiple factors that come together to make it so, like, what does bagpipe mean? It means the Highland bagpipe. And how do you play that? The way the military bands do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I agree with that a lot. My joking interpretation of it had always been, like, as much as we think of bagpipes as a Scottish thing, the weird reality is that Scotland was sort of the last place to get bagpipes. And so when the rest of Europe was, like, moving on to other things, it was like, oh, it's brand new. It's just like super exciting, brand new thing.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's totally accurate either. Yeah. But in timeline, I mean, it does sort of work out that, like, bagpipes sort of show up in Scotland after they've already been developed elsewhere. But yeah, I think colonialism has a huge part. That, like, the reality is that places where, you know, those folk traditions of bagpipes had sort of died out, and maybe they weren't as robust. You know, there are a lot of people's bagpipe tradition. It's a pretty pastoral thing you do when you're out with the flock.
Oh yeah,
alone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, like, you might have, I mean, like, the Italian bagpipe tradition of, like, it's so closely tied to Christmas celebrations and still being in, like, shepherd's clothing of, like, coming into the town and playing your, I'm gonna say Zamboni, but that's not what it's called. Zambona or whatever.
Zamponia?
Yeah.
No, or is that the Spanish one? I think that's the Spanish one. Anyway.
I think it's Zambonia. But yeah, anyway, that glorious giant instrument. Yeah, and whereas, you know, Highland piping is very much tied to aristocrats and court and wealthy folks. And there's some French music traditions that way too, but then they beheaded all those folks, so there's not quite as much of a, we should have a musette here. Like, let's not do that.
Maybe not that popular.
Yeah, but then when, you know, the bagpipe spreads to cultures that don't have bagpipes, it's the Scottish one is what they see first. So,
yes. Yeah.
I think that's how it kind of has supremacy. But
yeah. Now, let me kind of shift us toward a graceful close here. If you, Jeremy, had only one instrument that you could play for the rest of your life, what's it going to be?
That's such a mean question.
I know, right? Speculate the grim possibilities. Go on.
Oh, it's hard. Like, I have to make these decisions whenever I travel, I feel like.
Yeah.
And lately, like, every time I've gone to Scotland, I've brought Highland pipes, mostly because they're easier to travel with, too. But I was kind of speculating about, in theory, I might be going back to do some, depending on how things go, I might be going to Scotland to do some research in the next year or two. And the idea of not taking an uilleann pipe was like, well, that's not a possibility. To the point where I was like kind of speculating about just buying a new instrument that would be distracting. So I was like, I'll get a set of John Swain border pipes while I'm over there, because they're sort of like the perfect hybrid between Highland pipes and uilleann pipes. And but yeah, I don't know. It is clear to me that Highland pipes are still my best instrument. But if I only had one instrument for the rest of my life, it might be a whistle. I don't know.
Interesting. I didn't expect it to be a whistle. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would miss the leading note or whatever, the low C or the low G. Oh, I don't know, man. That's brutal. I keep on thinking about during the pandemic, we started watching, like, Alone, that, you know, the, like, bushcraft show where people are out in the bush and stuff. And you get to take 10 items. I'm like, well, there's no way I'm not taking a bagpipe as one of my 10 items.
Jeremy shows up to the show with, like, I only have 6 items that aren't bagpipes.
Right, yeah, exactly. I brought a match and 6 different types of bagpipes. Right. It'll be fine. Awesome. Yeah, I don't know. It's recently I did, because uilleann pipes are sort of new to me and they're more exciting to me. I tend to play more of them. I mean, they're not new to me. I've played them almost exactly as long, but having this new chanter really helps. And I've spent less time seriously on it than I did Highland pipes. And so my podcast tends to lean more towards uilleann piping than Highland piping. But I'm a way better Highland piper than I'm uilleann piper. So it's I get self-conscious about not having enough Highland piping on, especially because I think most of my listeners are Highland pipers that are interested in dabbling in other stuff. But yeah, I released an episode not too long ago that was a bunch of tunes from a 1780 collection or later, a guy named James Aird, which is not a bagpipe collection, but there's a bunch of tunes in there that seem to be bagpipe tunes. And so I played through a bunch of those, including one that Breacha Campbell does. I have an episode where I play a track from her, and it's because she does the same tune. And yeah, so it was like mostly Highland piping, and somebody that I talk with quite a bit, they're like, don't take this wrong, but you're really pretty good. Like, you've gotten a lot better. It's like, yeah, it's only because I didn't torture anybody with me trying to figure out how to play Uilleann pipes. It's like just me playing Highland pipes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I think I'd have a hard time not having Highland pipes in my life. But I love how long, when an Uilleann pipe reed is working, it lasts. So
yeah,
I guess, but that's why longevity-wise, I'm just making all kinds of caveats. That's why I whistle, because a whistle doesn't go out of tune or break, or so. Well, it does.
Right. So it like a solid titanium whistle, an adamantium whistle if possible. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
Technical difficulties.
But okay, so we're back together then. We are recording, so maybe we can do this live then. Let's go right for it in case this happens again. But so Jeremy, you've got your Uilleann pipes. Your grandma said to you, when I die, you can have a set of these pipes, and that happened, right?
Yeah, she passed away, and that's when I got the full set of Uilleann pipes.
And of course, I'm not in any way trying to like that's sad and that's hard, and I am sorry for that. But I'm glad you have the pipes. And you mentioned in one of the episodes that you'd written a Pibroch for them. Anything else you want to say about it or them?
Yeah, it was sort of cool. The I mean, whatever, death is a natural part of everything, but it still sort of sucks. And then you get these things that are really neat. So when my grandma passed away, we went through her safe, and she had kept these love letters from when she and my grandfather were right before they were married and kind of living apart. And it's just the cheesiest stuff in the world. It's all just, oh, I love you, darling, sweetheart, darling. And we only have like his perspective, like hers, she didn't keep her set of letters, obviously. But it was really sweet. He passed away a couple of years before her, and it was really, it was just a great way to mourn somebody, to find these letters that she had clearly been cherishing and kept close to her over 3 moves after he died. I just always thought that she was kind of revisiting these letters, thinking about passing away and being together with him too. So I wrote a tune. Wrote a tune for them called John and Mary Blair Salute or something. It's a Pibroch, and it's maybe the second Pibroch I wrote, and there's some things that I like it. It's a good tune.
And so, I don't mean to dig too much into it, but is this the tune that you wrote this tune in the wake of their passing, having reviewed these letters, or was it you wrote it before, like after your grandfather passed away and before your grandmother passed away? What was sort of the context from which this tune was born?
Yeah, no, I think I wrote it after she had passed away, and it wasn't like an immediate aftermath of these letters, but the letters definitely informed the playing of it. Part of the reason I wanted to start writing Pibroch is I was frustrated with people insisting that it had to be done a certain way. And I was like, well, if I am not allowed to play Pibroch in a way that I want to, unless I write it, I guess that's what I'll have to do. And then also just because, while I didn't feel like I could contribute anything to the hornpipe jig writing community, Pibrochs are awesome and feel like a great way to like commemorate or record a thing. And remember it, and so I did it. And so there's part of the Pibroch that has like where it's basically an A-A-B setup, where you played the A part twice and the B part, and then A-B-B and then A-B. But there's always part of it that doesn't quite connect right, like that's sort of the out of loop thing, and that was because of the letters, like realizing that they had this part of the relationship where they were separated from one another, and really, I mean, they would again. He was working at a printer shop many miles away from Wichita where she was living, but that was in 1940, I think. But as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, he enlisted, and so they wound up being away from one another for a while too. But yeah, growing up as a kid and they're like visiting them and being around them, like they acted like newlyweds, like these people that had been together since the 40s, but they were still like just so painfully, obviously, in love with one another, and kind of this flirtatious nature that was just, it was just so great to see. It was such a great example of like what love can be and should be. Yeah. So anyway, so yeah, this is the tune that I wrote for them, and the other part of that, so Grandma was two things. It was, you can buy a set of Uilleann pipes when I die, and you can go to Scotland when I die. And so I kind of played, every time I'm in Scotland, I always think of her and play the tune around quite a bit. And but the other thing I love about playing Pibroch that you wrote is like, nobody can accuse you of doing it wrong. And so every time I make a mistake, I'm like, no, that's just representing them being apart from one another.
There you go. Yeah.
How difficult that was. But,
it's the messiness of life.
yeah. But it was, it was when my brother got married, I was like, I should write a tune for them. And then just like having to write a tune on demand that's worthy of a thing is pretty hard. Yeah. And so I came close, and then I was like, wait, I've already got a tune. I'll just play this. So it's kind of, it's my go-to like family Pibroch. But as the only like bagpiper in the family, whenever like an aunt or an uncle dies, I'm like, well, we do have a family Pibroch, or I could play Amazing Grace. It's always Amazing Grace, but but in my head, this is always the tune that we should be playing.
January 23rd, 1940. Dearest Mary Louise, well, I got the job. Now it's me that's gone. Turnabout fair play. I got out here at about 2. I talked to the boss, and he told me he had 2 other fellows to see yet, but I got it. He told me where I could get a room. I didn't like it, so I went and looked for myself. Got one for $2 a week. The job don't pay very much, but I think I can get by. It pays $7.50 a week. I get off Saturday noon. I'm coming right home. Not as if it isn't storming. I sure hope it isn't storming. It sure is lonesome out here. I sure do miss you, darling. I'll see you Saturday night. Sure seems a long way off. Now you be real good and don't make eyes at any other boys. There's a young lady working here. Well, don't get too excited. It's the boss's wife. I guess I fooled you. Goodbye, darling. Take good care of yourself. Tell everybody hello for me. Goodbye. Lots of love, Johnny. March 25th. Hello, sweetheart. I'm back again. I don't know much to say, but I thought I'd just write a line to tell you that I love you. You are the most precious thing ever. I love you so much. Hello, precious. I'm back again. Doggone still love you. I love you an awful lot. Boy, are your cookies good. I love you so much, precious. Honey, don't start planning about getting married in the fall. Maybe things will churn our way pretty soon. I sure hope so. April 30th. Dearest, sweetheart, darling. Gosh, sweetheart, I miss you. I love you so much. I sure hope this week goes fast. I'm awful tired of this single life. I love you so much, precious. I slept pretty good last night. I don't think the people who owns the house will be snoopy. She asked me for permission to come in and hang some curtains. I sure hope they stay that way. Gosh, sweetheart, I love you so much. I'm going to get the marriage license tomorrow noon. Boy, I'll be glad when we are married. Darn it, honey. If I had it to do over, I would insist that we got married last Sunday. This waiting a week is terrible. But I hope you don't have time to get lonesome. I'm pretty sure you won't. I love you, precious. I'm going down to the post office soon to have my address changed. Boy, I want those letters. May 1st. Hello, precious. I'm back again. Just got through eating supper. I have to go back to work at 7. I haven't much time to write. I love you, sweetheart. I don't suppose you will have time to read all the letter, but maybe you will get the main points. Goodbye, precious. I'll see you Saturday. Your loving sweetheart. I love you. XXXXX. Johnny. XXXX.